The morning sun spilled through the towering windows of the courthouse, casting long, golden streaks across the polished mahogany benches. The air inside the grand room carried the faint scent of aged wood and crisp legal papers, a quiet testament to the countless dramas that had unfolded within these walls over generations. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of a spectator shifting in their seat, seemed amplified in the charged silence. The tension hung thick, pressing against the chests of everyone present, as if the very building itself were holding its breath, bracing for the storm about to break loose. At the center of this brewing tempest stood Miriam Carter, her wrists bound by cold, unyielding steel. The handcuffs bit into her skin with a cruel persistence, leaving faint red marks that pulsed with every heartbeat. They were tighter than necessary, a silent declaration from her captors. No matter her stature, no matter her achievements, here she was reduced to a figure in chains. She stood tall despite it, her posture unwavering, though the weight of 100 piercing gazes bore down on her like a physical force. Each stare carried its own judgments, some curious, some skeptical, most already convinced of her guilt before she'd even uttered a word. To them, she was just another name on a docket, another black woman in handcuffs, her story already written in their minds. The whispers slithered through the room, sharp and cutting, slicing away at her dignity with every hushed syllable. Across from her, Officer Mark Reynolds stood like a statue carved from arrogance. His chest swelled beneath his pristine uniform, the silver badge pinned to it catching the harsh fluorescent light and glinting with an almost mocking brilliance. He'd polished it that morning, no doubt, preparing for this momentous moment. His broad shoulders squared, his jaw set. He radiated the unshakable confidence of a man who'd bent the world to his will time and time again. His voice rolled out steady and deep, each word dripping with the authority of someone who'd spent years wielding the power of his position like a weapon. He'd done this before, stood in courtrooms just like this one, spinning tales that twisted the truth into knots so tight no one dared unravel them. He'd watched people crumble under the weight of his lies, seen lives dismantled with a few well-placed words, and today, he was certain, would be no different. "She's guilty," he proclaimed, his tone ringing with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "We've got evidence ironclad, undeniable evidence leading her to a sprawling financial fraud scheme, fake businesses, money laundering, offshore accounts, a criminal hiding behind a polished mask." His words landed like hammer strikes, each one driving the narrative deeper into the room. The jury leaned forward, hanging on his every syllable, their faces a mix of fascination and quiet agreement. The prosecution team sat back, lips curling into smug half-smiles, content to let Reynolds carry their case on his broad shoulders. In the gallery, journalists scribbled furiously, pens scratching against notebooks as camera shutters clicked in a staccato rhythm. The spectators murmured among themselves, their voices a low buzz that grew louder with every accusation, feeding the electric tension that crackled through the air. Miriam felt it all, eyes, the whispers, the suffocating presumption of guilt pressing in from every direction. Beneath her calm exterior, a fire smoldered. It wasn't fear that churned in her chest. She'd faced worse than this, stared down bigger threats than a puffed-up officer with a vendetta. No, what burned within her was rage, raw, searing, and righteous. How dare he, how dare this man, cloaked in the borrowed credibility of his badge, stand there and unravel her life with such casual malice? She'd spent decades climbing, fighting, breaking through barriers that men like him had built to keep people like her down. She'd earned her place, forged a legacy of integrity and strength, only to have it dragged through the mud by a lie so bold it bordered on absurd. And yet, here she was, ensnared by the very system she'd dedicated her life to reforming, a system that let corruption fester unchecked, that rewarded men like Reynolds for their cruelty. He stepped closer then, his boots clicking against the hardwood floor, and his voice dropped to a low, venomous hiss meant only for her ears. "You thought you were untouchable, didn't you?" His lips twisted into a sneer, his eyes glinting with triumph. "You people always do, but the law doesn't play favorites." The words slithered over her, cold and deliberate, a taunt wrapped in a threat. She held his gaze, unflinching, her own eyes steady and piercing, but inside, her fury flared hotter. He thought he'd won. thought he'd pinned her beneath the weight of his fabricated story. He had no idea what was coming. In the back of the room, the heavy courtroom door creaked open, admitting a late arrival. A woman in a tailored dark suit slipped inside, her face a mask of stone as she leaned toward a government official seated in the last row. Her whispered words were lost in the hum of the crowd, unnoticed by most. But Jordan, Miriam's assistant, caught the movement from his seat in the gallery. His fists clenched tight, knuckles whitening as he fought to keep his composure. He'd been up all night, poring over documents, piecing together the truth that would shred Reynolds' lies to ribbons. He knew who Miriam really was, and he knew the storm she was about to unleash. His dark eyes flicked between her and the officer, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. He'd seen her endure too much already, watched her weather storms that would have broken lesser souls. This was nothing she couldn't handle. The judge, peering over the rim of his glasses, finally broke the charged silence. "You may now speak in your defense," he said, his voice gravelly but firm. For a moment, Miriam didn't move. She stood there, the cold metal still biting into her wrists, her body still aching from the rough treatment she'd endured in custody. Her dignity had been battered, her pride bruised, but her spirit, that remained unbreakable. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, letting the air fill her lungs as she lifted her chin with a quiet defiance that seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the room. "Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth and sharp as tempered steel, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The courtroom, buzzing with restless energy just moments before, fell into a stunned hush. "Before I address these accusations, I think it's only fair I introduce myself properly." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Savoring the subtle ripple of unease that passed through the crowd, Reynolds' smirk faltered. Just for a fraction of a second, his fingers twitching at his sides. Something in her tenacam, commanding, dangerous, sent a shiver of doubt through him, though he masked it quickly behind his usual bravado. She let the silence stretch, drawing out the tension until it was almost unbearable. Then, with a faint, knowing smile, she spoke again. "My name is Miriam Carter," she said, her voice rising with unshakable authority. "Chief of the Pentagon of the United States." The words detonated in the room like a thunderclap. Pens froze mid-scratch, breaths caught in throats, and gasps erupted from the gallery. The judge's stern expression cracked, his eyes widening as disbelief warred with dawning realization. Reynolds stiffened, the color leaching from his face as the weight of her revelation crashed over him like a tidal wave. The courtroom doors swung open again, and this time every head turned. High-ranking federal officers strode in, their polished shoes echoing against the floor, their faces grim and purposeful. The air shifted, heavy with the promise of reckoning. Reynolds' confident facade crumbled, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the game had changed. Miriam stood taller, her gaze locked on him now, a silent vow in her eyes. Justice would be served, and the consequences of his abuse of power would be his undoing. In that moment, the lesson was clear, louder than any verdict could ever be. Power, when wielded to oppress, could only stand so long before the truth tore it down. Reynolds had built his castle on lies, but Miriam's strength, her unyielding resolve, was the storm that would raze it to the ground. And as the federal officers closed in, the room held its breath, waiting for the real story to begin, and where justice, long delayed, would finally claim its due. In the dimly lit expanse of the courtroom, the air hung heavy, saturated with anticipation and unspoken stakes, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The moment wasn't ripping out yet. Every tick of the clock mattered in a high-stakes dance like this, where precision was king and missteps could unravel everything. For now, they had no choice but to let Detective Mark Reynolds bask in his carefully orchestrated triumph, to let him revel in the illusion that he held all the strings. Reynolds stood there, chest subtly puffed, his every gesture dripping with the thrill of dominance. Power surged through him like a live current, an addictive rush that drowned out any whisper of doubt or conscience. This wasn't about justice or uncovering truth. For him it never had been. It was about control, pure and unadulterated, the kind he'd spent years cultivating by twisting the system into a tool for his own ends. He'd molded it, bent it, ensured that his version of reality was the only one that held weight. Now, as he gazed across the room at Miriam Carter standing shackled and silent, a surge of invincibility coursed through him, warming his veins. This was the pinnacle he'd dreamed of, the chance to cut her down, to remind her and everyone watching that no matter how far she'd risen, she'd always be at the mercy of his narrative. Reynolds' eyes glinted with satisfaction as he watched her, savoring the sight of her powerlessness. He'd waited years for this, nursing a quiet vendetta that had festered into obsession. Miriam had climbed too high, wielded too much influence, and dared to defy the unspoken rules he thrived on. To him, her presence in cuffs was more than a victory, it was a lesson etched in stone. The world didn't bend for people like her. The jury, their faces a gallery of preconceived notions, stared back at her with eyes already clouded by judgment. It didn't matter that she'd shattered ceilings or built a legacy in their minds. She was just another figure to be sized up and dismissed, her fate sealed before the gavel had even struck. The judge, perched high on his bench, finally stirred. His movements were deliberate, the slow adjustment of his wire-rimmed glasses casting faint reflections of the courtroom lights across his face. His expression remained a fortress, giving nothing away, as if he'd seen 1,000 dramas like this unfold, and had long since stopped caring about the endings. When he spoke, his voice cut through the stillness with the weight of ritual, each word measured and polished from years of repetition. Does the defendant have anything to say in her defense? The question landed like a stone in a pond, rippling outward, pulling every gaze toward Miriam. The room fell into a suffocating hush, the kind that presses against the chest and stifles breath. Reporters gripped their pens tighter, ink-stained fingers trembling with the promise of a headline. Cameras trained on her, lenses glinting like predators' eyes, waiting to capture the crack in her armor they all assumed was coming. Miriam stood motionless for a heartbeat, her wrists chafing against the cold bite of the handcuffs. The pain was there, sharp and insistent, but she pushed it to the edges of her mind. A minor nuisance compared to the weight of the moment. She drew a slow, deep breath, letting it fill her lungs as she lifted her head. Her posture was a study in control, shoulders squared, spine straight, every motion deliberate. When her eyes met the room, they carried a quiet fire, an unshakable resolve that sent a shiver of unease through the onlookers. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a blade wrapped in velvet, steady, smooth, and lethal in its precision. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, the faintest curve of a smile tugging at her lips, a flicker of defiance that seemed to dare the room to underestimate her again. "I do." The shift was electric, a crackle in the air that jolted the smug certainty of the prosecution. Reynolds' face betrayed him for a fleeting second, a twitch of hesitation, a shadow of doubt so brief most missed it. But not Miriam. She caught it, filing it away like a card up her sleeve. The prosecution's lead attorney, Richard Calloway, faltered too, his polished veneer slipping just enough to reveal the unease beneath. There was something in her tone, a quiet certainty that didn't align with the broken, desperate figure they'd painted her to be. In the back of the room, unnoticed by the throng of spectators, two men slipped through the doors, dressed in dark suits that seemed to absorb the light. They moved with the silent authority of those who answer to no one in this space. Their eyes locked onto Miriam, sharp and unwavering, their presence a subtle undercurrent of power that didn't belong to mere bystanders. They weren't here to scribble notes or gawk, they were players in a game no one else had yet clocked. Reynolds shifted in his seat, a cold prickle racing down his spine like a warning he refused to heed. Something was off, a nagging itch he couldn't scratch, but he buried it beneath layers of arrogance. He'd built this moment brick by brick, he wouldn't let it slip now. Miriam, meanwhile, adjusted her stance, the cuffs digging deeper into her skin. She barely registered the discomfort. Her entire career had been a series of rooms like Thistophy, male-dominated spaces where men in suits dismissed her with a glance, assuming they could write her story without her input. But this time was different. This time, the pen was in her hand, and Reynolds, along with everyone else, was about to learn that the tale he'd spun was nothing more than a house of cards waiting to collapse. The courtroom itself felt alive, its high ceilings and marble floors amplifying every sound, rustle of papers, the faint creak of wooden benches, the soft tap of Calloway's polished shoes as he paced before the jury. The air was thick, not just with tension, but with something darker, more primal, a stew of bias, unchecked power, and a system rigged to grind down anyone who didn't fit its mold. Miriam stood at its heart, a lone figure against a tide of expectation. Her calm a stark rebuke to the storm brewing around her. She'd faced down titans before, men who thought their titles made them untouchable, but never like Thishan's bound, a jury already sold on her guilt, the weight of a lie pressing down on her shoulders. Yet she didn't waver. She couldn't afford to. Calloway cleared his throat, a practiced gesture that drew every eye to him. He was in his element here, a shark circling its prey, his tailored suit gleaming under the harsh lights. He thrived in these arenas, a master of bending truth just enough to make it sound like gospel. Turning to the jury, he adopted a frown, a calculated bit of theater. Disappointment etched into his features as if he were a weary father scolding a wayward child. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a smooth drawl, laced with a fox sincerity that made Miriam's stomach churn. "I ask you to look closely at the defendant. On the outside, she's a picture of poise, confident, professional, a woman who's spent years polishing her image, convincing the world she's above reproach. But as we've shown today, looks can lie." His words slithered into the jurors' minds, planting doubts like seeds in fertile soil. Some nodded faintly, their expressions hardening as they drank in the narrative Calloway fed them. Miriam watched it all unfold, her face a mask of stillness though inside. Her pulse thrummed with barely contained fury. Calloway gestured toward Reynolds, who sat at the prosecution's table, the epitome of quiet assurance. His uniform was crisp, metals gleaming faintly, a portrait of duty designed to contrast sharply with Miriam's restrained figure. "Detective Reynolds," Calloway continued, his tone softening into something almost reverent, "has devoted his life to this city. He's faced danger time and again to uphold justice, to keep our streets safe. And today, he's brought us evidence, irrefutable proof that this woman, for all her accolades, is nothing but a fraud." The words landed with a thud, each one a brick in the wall they'd built to bury her. Miriam exhaled, slow and steady, anchoring herself against the tide. Across the room, she felt Jordan's eyes on her, her longtime ally, his silent urging for patience, a lifeline in the chaos. He knew what they had, the truth they'd guarded like a flame in a storm. But timing was everything, and they had to wait. The judge shifted again, his chair groaning faintly as he adjusted his glasses once more. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice flat, "you may respond." The silence stretched, taut and heavy, as every gaze locked onto her. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the haze like a beacon. "Your Honor, with all due respect, what we've heard today is an evidence site's a performance, a story tailored to fit their agenda. But no matter how well they spin it, a tale can't rewrite reality." Calloway let out a soft, condescending chuckle, shaking his head as if her words were the ramblings of a child. "Are you implying Detective Reynolds lied? That we've conspired against you? That's a bold claim." "Miss Carter." She met his stare, unflinching, her voice steady as granite. "I'm saying this isn't about justice, it's about who gets believed and who doesn't. And we all know how that story usually ends." A murmur rippled through the room, a wave of unease that Calloway quickly tried to smother with a tight smile. Reynolds' grip on his chair tightened, knuckles whitening, though his face remained a mask. The judge raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "Miss Carter, if you have evidence, now's the time." She took a breath, exchanging a fleeting glance with Jordan, a signal, a promise. Then she nodded. "I do." Reynolds' smirk flickered, a crack in his armor. Calloway turned, his eyes narrowing, sensing the ground shift beneath him. Miriam lifted her chin, her voice steady and sure. "Before I present," the room held its breath, the game tilting on its axis, and for the first time, the puppet masters realized they might not be pulling the strings after all. In that moment, the lesson crystallized. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fight, a clawing, relentless struggle against those who wielded power like a weapon. Reynolds had abused his, drunk on the thrill of control, blind to the consequences piling up like storm clouds. But power, when twisted too far, has a way of turning brittle, and Miriam was the hammer poised to shatter it. The depth of her resolve, the quiet strength of the men in suits, the unspoken loyalty of Jordanal of it wove a richer tapestry, one where the fallout of hubris would echo far beyond these walls. The courtroom held its breath as Miriam Carter stood poised, her presence a quiet storm brewing beneath a veneer of calm. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Detective Mark Reynolds, the man whose testimony had anchored the case against her. A faint ripple of unease passed through the room, the kind that precedes a reckoning. Reynolds, seated at the witness stand, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his broad shoulders tensing under his pressed uniform. His fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the table, betraying the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade. Beside him, Prosecutor Calloway leaned back, arms crossed, his lips curling into a smirk that oozed confidence, too much confidence, perhaps, for a man about to face the unraveling of his narrative. Miriam's voice cut through the stillness, steady and deliberate, each word landing like a stone dropped into a glassy pond. "I'd like to challenge the credibility of the primary witness in this case, Detective Reynolds." The air grew thick, the collective inhale of the room swallowed by a sudden, deafening silence. Calloway snapped to attention, his scoff slicing through the tension like a jagged blade. "Oh, please," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "This is nothing but a pathetic attempt to smear an officer with a spotless record." His words hung there, bold and brash, but beneath them lingered a flicker of doubt, a shadow he couldn't quite shake. Miriam tilted her head, a subtle gesture that carried the weight of a predator sizing up its prey. "Spotless?" she echoed, her voice soft but laced with an edge that made Reynolds flinch. "That's a curious way to put it, considering the developments that came to light just this morning." "Developments that might paint a very different picture." Her gaze locked onto Reynolds, unyielding, and for a moment the detective's mask slipped, his jaw clenched so tightly that a faint twitch pulsed along the muscle, his hazel eyes darting to the side as if searching for an escape. "She's stalling," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. But the acoustics of the room betrayed Memory only heard the tremor beneath his bravado. Miriam's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Stalling, no, Detective. I'm simply giving you a chance to come clean before the truth does it for you." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, the once stifled energy morphing into something volatile, electric. Calloway spun toward the judge, his movements sharp and frantic, like a man clutching at the last threads of control. "Your Honor, this is a blatant diversion tactic," he barked, his voice rising with indignation. But the judge, perched high on his bench, raised a hand, his weathered face unreadable save for the piercing glint in his eyes as they fixed on Miriam. "Proceed," he said, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. She nodded to her assistant, Jordan, a weary young man with a mop of dark curls and a quiet intensity that belied his unassuming frame. He rose swiftly, retrieving a hefty stack of documents from the defense table and handing them to the bailiff with a precision that suggested he'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. "These," Miriam began as the papers were passed among the jury, "are financial records, communication logs, and internal reports, irrefutable evidence tying Detective Reynolds to a pattern of misconduct." Her voice remained even, but there was a fire beneath it, a controlled burn that illuminated every syllable. "We're talking evidence tampering, coercion of witnesses, and most damningly, a financial transaction traced to an offshore account, deposited just days before my arrest." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs collided in a cacophony of disbelief, the jury leaning forward in their seats, some clutching the documents as if they might vanish, others exchanging hushed, urgent whispers. Reporters at the back scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the unraveling drama, their eyes bouncing between Miriam's unshakable calm and Reynolds' crumbling demeanor. The detective's face drained of color, his once steady hands now trembling faintly as they gripped the edge of the table. The confidence that had defined him, his squared shoulders, his clipped Respin cestisoled like smoke in a gale, leaving behind a man exposed, raw, and cornered. Calloway's composure fractured too, his dark eyes narrowing as he shot a glare at Reynolds, then at Miriam, his jaw working as if chewing on words he couldn't yet spit out. The judge's gavel crashed down, a thunderclap demanding order. But the echoes of that sound couldn't erase the shift that had taken place. The case, built on Reynolds' word, teetered on the edge of collapse, and Miriam Carter stood at its center, unflinching. A heavy silence descended, unlike any that had gripped the courtroom before. It wasn't the quiet of anticipation or the practiced pause before a ruling that was a void. A suffocating stillness born of shattered illusions. The jury sat rigid, their gazes flickering between the papers in their hands and the man they'd once trusted implicitly. Reynolds had gone still, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened, his breathing shallow and ragged. Miriam watched him, her expression a study in patience, her dark eyes glinting with the quiet certainty of someone who held all the cards. "Would you care to explain this, detective?" she asked, her voice slicing through the tension with surgical precision. "Or should I keep going?" Reynolds exhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring, but no words came. His silence was deafening, a confession in its own right. Calloway, desperate to regain footing, forced to laugh a brittle, hollow sound that fooled no one. "Your Honor, this is absurd." These so-called documents, the judge cut him off with a single raised hand, his stare cold and unyielding. "I'll decide what's absurd, Mr. Calloway." "Sit down." The command landed like a guillotine, and Calloway sank back into his chair, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Miriam pressed on, her tone measured but relentless. "The evidence before you doesn't just show a single lapse in judgment. It reveals a systemails, text messages, falsified reports spanning 5 years. Detective Reynolds has twisted testimonies, ruined lives, and orchestrated wrongful convictions for his own gain. And in this case, he fabricated the charges against me." The jury's hands rustled through the documents, their expressions morphing as the weight of her words sank in. A middle-aged woman with tight curls pressed her lips into a thin line, her fingers digging into the papers as if they burned her. Beside her, a man with a weathered face shook his head slowly, his brow furrowing in disgust, his faith in the system visibly eroding. Calloway tried once more, his voice sharp and brittle. "Your Honor, none of this changes. It changes everything," Miriam interjected, her words a whipcrack that silenced him mid-sentence. She turned to the jury, her gaze sweeping across their faces, locking eyes with each of them in turn. "Ask yourselves this: if a man would forge evidence, imprison the innocent, all for personal profit, what stops him from doing it again? And why should you believe a Simeon who's spent decades safeguarding this nation, upholding integrity, will throw it all away on something as petty as financial fraud?" Her question lingered, a challenge that gnawed at their doubts, eroding the foundation of the prosecution's case with every ticking second. Reynolds snapped. He lurched to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor, his chest heaving as panic clawed its way to the surface. "This is a goddamn setup," he roared, his voice ragged, his control slipping like sand through his fingers. Miriam met his outburst with a calm, unreadable stare. "Is it?" she replied, her tone cool and cutting. At that moment, the courtroom doors swung open with a resounding thud, and 2 federal agents stepped inside. The older one, with graying hair and a face etched with stern resolve, moved with the quiet authority of a man who'd seen the scene play out too many times. His partner, younger but no less imposing, followed close behind, their dark suits a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. Reynolds' breathing grew shallow, his pulse hammering visibly at his throat as his eyes darted between the agents, the judge, and Calloway now looked ashen, his hands gripping the table as if to steady himself. "You can't be serious," Reynolds hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, a plea to no one in particular. The older agent stepped forward, his voice ringing out like a tolling bell. "Detective Mark Reynolds, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, and conspiracy to commit perjury." Each charge landed like a physical blow, and the courtroom exploded, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, the jury gaping in stunned silence. Reynolds thrashed as the younger agent seized his arm, the sharp click of handcuffs snapping shut reverberating through the room, a sound that carried the bitter irony of justice turning full circle. "No, no, no," he bellowed, his face flushed with rage, his eyes wild with desperation. "You're making a mistake. I was doing my job. She's the criminal here, not me." But the agents were unmoved, their grip unrelenting as they hauled him toward the exit. Calloway stumbled back, shaking his head as if he could deny the reality unfolding before him. His polished veneer shattered beyond repair. Miriam remained still, her eyes tracking Reynolds as he was dragged away. His shouts echoing off the walls. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, his voice hoarse and venomous. "They'll never see you as one of them, Carterniver." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and piercing, like a blade held to his throat. "I don't need to be one of them, Reynolds," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I just needed them to see you for what you are." He opened his mouth to retort, but the doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his words, leaving only the weight of his downfall to settle over the room. In that moment, the lesson was clear. Justice, when wielded with precision, could topple even the mightiest abuser of power. Reynolds had built his career on lies, but the consequences of his actions buried beneath layers of deceit had risen to claim him. And Miriam, standing tall amid the wreckage, had proven that truth, though patient, was an unstoppable force. The federal agents dragged Mark Reynolds toward the courtroom's heavy double doors, their grip unyielding as his polished shoes scuffed against the floor. In a heartbeat, he was gone, swallowed by the corridor beyond, leaving behind a room suspended in stunned silence. The air grew thick, pressing down on every person present, as if the walls themselves were exhaling the tension of what had just unfolded. The judge, a man weathered by decades of presiding over human conflict, let out a long, shuddering breath. His hand moved slowly across his face, fingers trembling slightly as they traced the lines etched by years of hard decisions. Turning to the jury, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of finality. "I think we've seen enough," he said, each word dropping like a stone into the stillness. Miriam Carter stood motionless at the center of it all, her chest rising as she drew in a slow, deliberate breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tightness that had coiled around her heart began to loosen. The air rushed into her lungs, cool and sharp, tasting faintly of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Her entire life had been a battlefield, a relentless struggle against forces that sought to diminish her, to erase her voice before it could even be heard. She'd spent years proving her worth in ways others never had to imagine, clawing her way through a world that demanded she justify her existence at every turn. But today, in this suffocatingly grand room with its towering ceilings and stern wooden benches, she had emerged victorious. The triumph wasn't just hers, it reverberated through the space, witnessed by every soul present, a testament to a system that, for once, had bent toward justice. Her eyes found Jordan's across the room. He stood near the edge of the gallery, his broad shoulders tense but his gaze steady. In his deep brown eyes, she saw a quiet pride shimmering beneath the surface, a silent acknowledgement of what she'd achieved. His lips didn't move, but the tilt of his head spoke volumes, a shared understanding of the war they'd waged together. She'd taken on the beast of corruption head-on, and for once, the beast had blinked. Meanwhile, somewhere in the depths of his own ruin, Mark Reynolds felt the ground shift beneath him. The world he'd ruled with arrogance and impunity had crumbled, and as the agent's footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, he knew his reign was over. The lesson was brutal and clear. Power, when abused, carried a precision he was only beginning to comprehend. The courtroom buzzed with a chaotic energy that refused to settle. The sharp crack of the gavel still lingered in the air, mingling with the hushed whispers of spectators who couldn't quite process what they'd seen. The atmosphere was heavy, almost tangible, like a storm cloud pressing against the stained glass windows. The prosecution team sat at their table, once a fortress of unshakable confidence, now reduced to a tableau of broken men and women. Lead prosecutor Calloway gripped the edges of his desk, his knuckles whitening as though he could anchor himself against the tide of defeat. His face, usually a mask of calculated composure, betrayed a flicker of raw disbelief, while beside him, his junior counsel stared blankly at the floor, her hands folded tightly in her lap as if to keep herself from unraveling entirely. Another colleague, a younger man with sharp features, clenched his jaw so hard it looked like his teeth might crack, his eyes burning with a fury he couldn't voice. The jury, 12 ordinary people thrust into the heart of this reckoning, sat in silence. Their faces told a story of transformation, some furrowed with deep thought, others wide-eyed, as if the veil of the world they'd known had been torn away. A middle-aged woman in the front row twisted her hands nervously, her lips pressed into a thin line as she replayed the trial's revelations in her mind. Next to her, an older man with a weathered face stared straight ahead, his brow creased with the weight of a truth he hadn't expected to confront. They'd come into this room believing in a system, and now they were leaving it with questions that would haunt them for years. Beyond the bar, journalists scrambled to capture the moment. Pens scratched furiously across notepads, the sound of frantic counterpoint to the stillness of the principals. Cameras flashed like lightning, illuminating the room in brief. Blinding bursts as reporters jostled for position. A young woman with a press badge pinned crookedly to her jacket muttered to herself as she scribbled, her brow furrowed in concentration, while an older man with a grizzled beard barked orders to his photographer, desperate to freeze this seismic shift in time. They knew they were witnessing history, not just a trial, but a crack in the foundation of power itself. Miriam, though, remained the eye of the storm. She stood tall, her posture unbroken, her dark hair falling in soft waves around a face that radiated both exhaustion and resolve. Her presence filled the room, not with noise or grand gestures, but with a quiet strength that demanded recognition. She'd spent years navigating spaces like Thisgold, imposing rooms where her every word had to be a weapon, where her very existence was an act of rebellion against those who sought to silence her. Today, she didn't need to shout. The truth had roared for her, its voice echoing off the oak-paneled walls and into the hearts of everyone present. The federal agents lingered near the exit, their dark suits stark against the muted tones of the courtroom. The older one, a man with a streak of gray cutting through his dark hair, stood with his arms crossed, his face a map of hard-earned lines. He'd seen men like Reynolds before, arrogant, untouchable, until the moment they weren't. His eyes flicked to the judge, and he offered a slight nod, a gesture that carried the weight of years spent chasing justice through a maze of corruption. His younger partner, a weary man with restless energy, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand hovering near his radio as if expecting Reynolds to bolt even now. Their presence sent a ripple through the crowd, a reminder that this wasn't just a legal victory, it was a reckoning, a signal that no one was beyond the reach of consequence. Calloway, still clinging to his table like a drowning man to driftwood, finally found his voice. "Your Honor," he stopped, the words catching in his throat. The smooth, practiced cadence that had carried him through countless trials faltered, replaced by a raw edge of desperation. He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he fought to regain control. "I moved to request a recess to reevaluate." The plea hung in the air, fragile and absurd against the mountain of evidence that had just buried his case. Miriam's response was immediate, a soft, mirthless laugh that sliced through the tension like a blade. Every head turned to her, drawn by the sound. She tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes glinting with a mix of disbelief and disdain. "A recess?" she repeated, letting the word roll off her tongue as if tasting its audacity. "Mr. Calloway, we don't need a recess. What we need is accountability." Her voice was steady, cutting, each syllable a hammer striking the coffin of his defense. She stepped forward slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "Your prosecution has spent this entire trial weaving a tapestry of Lee's manipulated evidence, fabricated testimony, all propped up by a corrupt officer who was just hauled out of here in chains. And now, when the truth stands undeniable before you, your answer is to ask for more time." The room seemed to hold its breath as her words settled over them, heavy and unyielding. Calloway's face darkened, his lips parting as if to retort, but nothing came. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his mind racing for a lifeline that wasn't there. The judge leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, his eyes piercing through the haze of Calloway's crumbling composure. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice a deep rumble of authority, "unless you have something substantive to offer, I see no reason to drag this out any longer." It wasn't a question, it was a command, forged in the fire of too many cases where justice had been delayed or denied. Calloway glanced at his team, searching for support, but they offered none. The junior counsel looked away, her hands still clasped tightly, while the younger man's burning gaze shifted to the floor, defeated. Calloway's fingers flexed against the table, the wood creaking under his grip. And for the first time in his storied career, he stood on a battlefield with no weapons left to wield. "I have nothing further, Your Honor," he muttered, the words bitter and jagged as they left his mouth. The silence that followed was a thunderclap, reverberating through the room with the force of a verdict all its own. The judge nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to Miriam. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone softening but still carrying the gravity of the moment. "You are free to go." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, a release of tension that had been building for hours, days, years. The bailiff stepped forward, his movements deliberate as he unlatched the cold metal cuffs from Miriam's wrists. The steel fell away with a faint clink, and she flexed her fingers, marveling at the sensation of freedom returning to her hands. It was a small act, but it felt monumental, a reclaiming of what had been stolen from her. Piece by piece, over a lifetime of struggle, Jordan was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room with purposeful strides. His eyes blazed with a storm of emotions, fury at the system that had dared to chain her, pride at the woman who had shattered it. "Miriam," he said, his voice low and thick, catching slightly on her name. He hesitated, then closed the distance between them, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "You did it." She met his gaze, and for the first time that day, a faint smile curved her lips. "No," she corrected softly, her voice unwavering despite the exhaustion creeping into her bones. "We did." His throat tightened, and he nodded, his expression a mask of restraint save for the flicker of something raw and personal in his eyes. He'd stood by her through every blow, every betrayal, and now they stood together on the other side of it all. A sudden stir in the gallery drew her attention. An older woman with silver hair and hands clasped so tightly her knuckles gleamed white rose from her seat. Tears glistened in her eyes as she gave Miriam a single, firm note, a quiet salute from someone who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty to take this moment lightly. Beside her, a man in a rumpled suit, his tie loosened from hours of waiting, lifted his chin in a gesture of respect, his tired eyes bright with admiration. One by one, others followed, rising silently to their feet. It wasn't a grand ovation, no cheers or applause, but a profound, unspoken recognition of the shift that had just occurred, a crack in the armor of power, a step toward justice. Calloway stared down at his hands, his knuckles still pale against the dark wood. His career would endure, he'd claw his way back, piece by piece, but this day would haunt him. The memory of Miriam dismantling his case with nothing but the truth would linger like a scar. She turned away from him, her shoulders straightening as she walked toward the exit. She didn't look back, not at him, not at the room, not at the chaos she'd left in her wake. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clear, the air crisp against her skin as it brushed away the weight she'd carried for so long. But she knew this wasn't the end. There would be headlines, investigations, fallout. Mark Reynolds wouldn't fade quietly, men like him never did, their shadows stretching long even in defeat. Jordan fell into step beside her, his hands buried in his pockets, his face unreadable. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice cutting through the hum of the city beyond the courthouse steps. She exhaled, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her mind already racing ahead. "Now," she said, her tone quiet but resolute, "we make sure this never happens again." Round them, the world was shifting, rearranging itself around the truth she'd forced into the light. The press swarmed the steps below, cameras flashing like a storm, voices clamoring for her attention. But Miriam moved forward, her steps steady, Jordan at her side, ready to face whatever came next. The lesson was clear: justice, when wielded with courage, could topple even the mightiest towers of corruption, and its echoes would ripple far beyond this day. The air buzzed with tension as he stood there, a towering figure amidst the chaos, his broad shoulders cutting a steady silhouette against the restless throng of reporters and onlookers. His gaze swept over the crowd like a hawk, sharp and unyielding, sizing up every flicker of intent in their eager faces. He'd been in too many rooms like this before, spaces thick with the stench of half-truths, where words were spun into webs of deceit before they even had a chance to settle. He'd witnessed the powerful bend reality with nothing more than a sly turn of phrase, their influence a heavy hand on the scales of truth. And now, as the clamor swelled around them, he understood perhaps better than anyone that the raw, unvarnished truth laid bare in that courtroom earlier wouldn't simply be embraced by the world. No, it would be met with resistance, with denial, with the kind of pushback that clung like damp rot to the foundations of justice. Beside him, Miriam Carter felt the weight of it all pressing against her chest, a suffocating force she refused to let break her. The courtroom victory still echoed in her mind, the judge's gavel a thunderclap that had shattered years of lies. But out here, in the open, the triumph felt fragile, like a flame flickering in a storm. A young journalist, breathless with the thrill of the chase, lunged forward, thrusting a microphone toward her. His voice trembled with urgency, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Miss Carter, do you think today's verdict will be enough to rebuild the public's faith in the justice system?" Before she could draw a breath to respond, another voice sliced through the din, sharp and insistent. "What about the other cases Detective Reynolds might have tampered with? Are more investigations coming? Are you going after the department itself?" Then a third, colder and more pointed, cut deeper still. "Do you feel safe, Miss Carter, with the backlash brewing among certain law enforcement circles? Are you worried about retaliation?" Miriam's lips tightened into a thin, resolute line, her dark eyes darting across the sea of face, each one hungry, expectant, poised to pounce. Every question was a trap, meticulously crafted to snag a headline, to fuel an agenda. Some wanted a triumphant soundbite they could splash across front pages, a neat little victory bow to tie up the mess. Others hunted for a spark of rage, a slip they could twist into scandal, something to keep the news cycle churning. The pressure bore down on her like a physical thing, a crushing weight threatening to unsteady her footing. But she wouldn't bend. She wouldn't let them rush her into a corner, wouldn't hand over the raw pieces of her soul for them to carve up and sell. She stopped walking abruptly, the swarm of reporters tightening around her like wolves circling a wounded deer. Jordan, her steadfast shadow, tensed at her side, his hand twitching as if ready to yank her free from the fray. His jaw was set, his eyes darting warily between the encroaching figures, every muscle coiled to act. But Miriam raised a hand, just a slight lift of her fingers, and he froze, reading the unspoken command in her gesture. She let the silence stretch, thick and deliberate, forcing the crowd to lean in, their anticipation palpable. When she finally spoke, her voice was a calm, steady current cutting through the noise, each word measured and deliberate, as if she were laying bricks for a foundation no one could topple. "Today wasn't about restoring trust," she said, her gaze locking onto the horizon of faces, unblinking and fierce. "It was about dragging the truth into the light. Trust isn't something you patch up with a single win. It's forged through accountability, through facing the consequences of power gone unchecked. And that work, it's nowhere near done." The crowd erupted into a low roar of murmurs, pencils scratching furiously against notebooks as the journalists sensed a story swelling into something larger, something uncontainable. Miriam didn't flinch, her voice held firm, a blade slicing through the chaos. "There will be more investigations, though. Every case Detective Reynolds poisoned with his corruption, every life he crushed under the weight of his deceit. Innocent people have suffered, their voices drowned out by a system that shielded him, that let him wield his badge like a weapon. We can't turn away from that. This isn't just one man's failure, it's a sickness in the system itself, a rot that festers when power goes unquestioned. Unless we rip it out at the roots, it'll grow back stronger." A reporter near the front, her face a mask of cool detachment, raised a hand. Her question hung in the air like a challenge. "Do you really believe real change is possible?" Miriam paused, exhaling slowly, her head tilting as she weighed the enormity of the words. Her career had been a battlefield, a relentless slog through the muck of bureaucracy and broken promises. She'd fought wars that shouldn't have needed fighting, watched reform choke beneath layers of red tape, seen the powerful choose comfort over justice, self-interest over the cries of the wronged. Yet today, something had shifted. The courtroom, once a fortress ready to bury her, had cracked open, forced to reckon with the light she'd dragged in. "Change is possible," she said at last, her voice softer but no less resolute. "But only if we refuse to blink, only if we drag men like Reynolds out of the shadows and hold not just them, but the institutions that cradle them to account. This isn't about one crooked cop, it's about a system that thrives on silence, that rewards abuse until someone dares to scream. Her words sank into the air, heavy and unyielding, and for a fleeting moment, the crowd stilled, absorbing the gravity of what she'd unleashed. Then, from the back, a man's voice broke through, steady, deliberate, laced with an edge of warning. What about retaliation? A lot of people in law enforcement won't take kindly to this. You just tore down one of their own. Miriam's eyes found his, locking onto the unspoken threat beneath his tone. She'd felt it before, the quiet menace of those who'd whispered warnings in dimly lit corridors, who'd pressed her to let sleeping dogs lie. Now, with Reynolds exposed, his badge stripped away in disgrace, she was a target, a beacon for those who saw her as a disruptor, a traitor to their warped code. She straightened, her expression a wall of stone, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, defiant. Then let them stew in their discontent. The crowd exploded again, a frenzy of shouts and flashing cameras, the reporters scrambling to capture the raw fire of her words. Jordan let out a sharp breath beside her, muttering something about how that line would dominate every headline by dawn, his tone a mix of exasperation and grudging awe. But Miriam didn't care. She'd said what burned in her chest, and that was enough. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode away, the cacophony of voices fading behind her as the city loomed ahead, vast and restless, waiting to see what she'd do next. Hours later, the silence of her office wrapped around her like a shroud, heavy and unfamiliar. The space felt transformed, as if the day's upheaval had seeped into the walls themselves. Once, these shelves had been a fortress of order stacked with classified files, meticulous reports, and the blueprints of her strategies. Now, they seemed to hold something intangible, a quiet reverberation of the storm she'd ignited. She sat in her chair, elbows resting on the armrests, fingers pressed together in a steeple, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the wide windows where the city skyline glittered coldly. The truth she'd fought for was free now, but its consequences were only beginning to unfurl, rippling into shadows she couldn't yet reach. Across from her, Jordan slouched in his seat, his face tight with fatigue, his hands still clamped around his phone as he scrolled through the endless flood of updates. "Reynolds is already spinning his story," he said, his voice rough with frustration. "Or at least his lawyer is. They're painting this as a political hit, saying he's the fall guy for some grand conspiracy." Miriam barely blinked, her expression unreadable. "Of course they are," she murmured, her tone flat but edged with weary certainty. Jordan shook his head, his thumb flicking across the screen. "They're pushing hard, claiming he was just doing his job, that mistakes happen, that this is all part of some war on cops. It's gaining traction, too." She leaned back slightly, letting out a slow, measured breath. "Let them talk." Jordan's head snapped up, his brows knitting together. "That's it. Just let them talk. You're not going to push back." She met his gaze, her eyes steady, unyielding. "I don't need to. The truth already spoke louder than they ever will." He studied her for a long moment, the tension in his shoulders easing as he nodded, sinking back into his chair with a reluctant acceptance. "You really think this is over?" he asked, quieter now, the weight of the day settling into his voice. Miriam's lips pressed together, her mind churning through the endless threads of what lay ahead, the battles yet to come, the enemies still lurking. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but it's a beginning." The room fell silent, the air thick with the enormity of what they'd set in motion. Outside, the city pulsed on, oblivious to the tempest brewing beneath its glittering surface. Somewhere out there, in corners she couldn't yet see, the fallout of her stand was already taking shape, consequences that would test the fragile justice she'd fought to reclaim. And in that dim office, lit only by the faint glow of the skyline, the lesson hung heavy. Power, when abused, breeds corruption, but justice, when pursued relentlessly, can carve a path through even the darkest of storms. In the dimly lit office, the air hung heavy with the residue of a day that had shifted the world beneath their feet. Jordan let out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed off the walls, the sound jagged and raw, like glass breaking under pressure. He dragged a hand across his face, fingers pressing into his temples as if he could physically push away the disbelief gnawing at him. Unbelievable, he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion and something dark-ranger that had nowhere to go but inward. Across the room, Miriam snapped back to the present, her eyes fluttering as she pulled herself out of the labyrinth of her thoughts. Her face was a mask, unreadable to anyone who didn't know her well. But beneath that calm exterior churned a storm of resolve and quiet fury. She shifted in her chair, the leather creaking faintly under her weight, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but deliberate, cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's not unbelievable," she said, her gaze steady as it met his. "It's predictable." Jordan's hand froze mid-motion, his phone clattering onto the desk with a dull thud. He stared at her, his dark eyes narrowing as frustration simmered just below the surface. "Predictable or not, that doesn't make it any less maddening," he shot back, his fingers beginning to tap an erratic rhythm against the polished wood. Each tap was a release, a small rebellion against the helplessness threatening to swallow him whole. They're doing what they've always done, encircling the wagons, shielding their own, spinning the story to fit their needs. This was never just about Reynolds. He was a cog, a single gear in their machine, and now that he's gone, they're scrambling to patch the holes before the whole damn thing collapses. Miriam exhaled slowly, a measured breath that carried the weight of years spent navigating this treacherous game. She leaned back slightly, her posture rigid yet composed, as if steeling herself for the fight she knew was far from over. "They're not just protecting a man," she said, her tone low and deliberate. "They're protecting power." Reynolds was expendably a sacrifice to appease the public's outrage at the system he served. That's what they're desperate to keep intact. Jordan's tapping grew faster, more insistent, his restlessness spilling over. "So what's our move?" he asked, his voice tight with barely restrained impatience. "Do we just sit here, twiddling our thumbs, while they rewrite the story before the ink's even dry?" Miriam studied him for a long, heavy moment, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw the fire there, the same spark that had drawn her to him as an ally, but also the weariness creeping in at the edges. "No," she said finally, her voice steady as granite. "We don't sit back. We dig deeper. We make sure the truth doesn't get buried under their lies." A dry, humorless chuckle escaped Jordan's lips as he shook his head, strands of dark hair falling into his eyes. "You make it sound so simple," he said, the sarcasm masking a flicker of admiration he couldn't quite hide. Miriam leaned forward now, her hands resting on the desk, fingers splayed against the cool surface. Her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, the air thicker. "Nothing about this is simple, Jordan," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry the weight of her conviction. "But if we let them turn today into nothing more than a flashy show, for the cameras, then everything we've fought for, everything I've endured, becomes just another headline. And I didn't claw my way through this hell for a footnote." Jordan sighed, the sound heavy and resigned. He pinched the bridge of his nose, his shoulders slumping as the exhaustion of the day settled into his bones. But when he looked up, there was a spark of agreement in his eyes. "All right," he said, his tone shifting to something firmer. "What's the next step?" For a fleeting moment, Miriam hesitated, her mind racing through the possibilities, weighing the risks she knew were barreling toward them. Then she straightened, her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. "We go after the cases he poisoned," she said, her words precise and unyielding. "Every single person Reynolds locked away with fake evidence, coerced confessions, or outright corruption will fight for them. We demand reviews, push for retrials, file appeals. This isn't about taking down one man anymore. It's about dismantling the rot he left behind." Jordan's eyes widened, a mix of awe and trepidation flashing across his face. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You realize what that means, don't you? Today was messy. But this is diving headfirst into the deep end. The further we dig, the more dangerous it gets." Miriam nodded, her expression unflinching, a fortress of determination. "I know," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had carried her through countless battles. Jordan searched her face, hunting for any crack, any hint of doubt. He found none. Instead, he saw the same fierce resolve that had defined her from the start, the unshakable will that had turned her into a force of nature. He leaned back, a faint, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Her lips curved slightly, a ghost of a smile that held no warmth, only purpose. "If I'd quit every time someone told me to, I wouldn't be sitting here now," she replied, her tone dry but edged with steel. Jordan exhaled sharply, a sound that was half laugh, half surrender. "Fair enough," he said, nodding. "Then let's do it." Before they could map out their next move, a sharp knock shattered the silence. Miriam's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. Its hands pointed far past the hour, when the building should have emptied out. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, her presence filling the room like a shadow stretching long across the floor. She was older, her dark suit crisp and immaculate, her posture stiff with an authority that didn't need to announce itself. Her face was a blank slate, but her eye sharp and calculating betrayed the weight of the secret she carried. Miriam recognized her instantly. "Director Vaughn," she said, her voice neutral but tinged with wariness, like a soldier greeting an untested ally. "I didn't expect you tonight." Vaughn's gaze darted to Jordan for a split second, assessing him, before settling back on Miriam. "We need to talk," she said, her tone clipped and commanding. "Privately." Jordan glanced at Miriam, his brow furrowing as he waited for her cue. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. With a reluctant huff, he grabbed his phone and rose, casting one last look her way, a silent question hanging in the air before stepping out and shutting the door behind him with a soft click. Vaughn took a slow, deliberate step forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like the ticking of a countdown. Her eyes bore into Miriam's, sharp and unyielding. "You've stirred up quite a tempest today," she said, her voice low and measured, each word chosen with care. Miriam met her stare head-on, her posture unwavering. "I did what had to be done," she replied, her tone even but laced with defiance. Vaughn nodded slightly, as if she'd anticipated that answer. "And now you're planning to keep going," she said, not a question but a statement, heavy with implication. Miriam didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, her voice a quiet thunder. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick and charged, before Vaughn stepped closer, her expression darkening. "I came here to warn you, Carter," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You might think this fight ended in that courtroom, but it's only the beginning. You've exposed Reynolds, and now the people who thrived under his corruption are watching you. Some are biding their time, waiting for you to slip. Others," she paused, her eyes narrowing, a shadow of something colder flickering in them. "Others won't wait." Miriam held her gaze, her breath steady despite the weight of those words sinking into her chest. "I know the risks," she said, her voice firm, unshaken. Vaughn studied her for a long moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then she nodded, a grudging acknowledgement. "Good," she said, "because from here on out, your enemies aren't just in that courtroom. They're in places you can't even see." Miriam inhaled slowly, her mind racing, but her face betraying nothing. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with a challenge. Vaughn's expression didn't shift. "It's a fact," she said flatly. The silence that followed was suffocating, a storm held at bay. Then, without another word, Vaughn turned on her heel and strode toward the door. Just before stepping out, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Be careful, Carter," she said, her voice softer now, almost human. "You're playing in a different league now." And with that, she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her like the closing of a trap. Miriam sat there, alone in the stillness, the echo of Vaughn's warning settling over her like a shroud. She'd always known this fight wouldn't end with Reynolds' fall. She'd always understood that the system didn't crumble so easily it clawed back. It adapted. It struck from the shadows. But hearing it laid bare, knowing that unseen forces were already tightening their grip, sent a shiver down her spine she refused to acknowledge. The door swung open again, and Jordan stepped back in, his easy stride faltering as he caught the shift in her expression. "What happened?" he asked, his voice cautious, laced with a protective edge. Miriam exhaled, then rose to her feet, her shoulders squaring as she pushed the unease aside. "We keep moving," she said simply, her mind already spinning through the next steps, the next battles. Jordan studied her, his brow furrowing, but he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice steadying. "Then let's get to work." They stepped out into the hallway, the silence there thick and oppressive, the kind that hinted at a world still reeling from the day's upheaval. Miriam's heels clicked against the marble floor, each step a declaration of intent, her mind racing 5 moves ahead. Jordan walked beside her, his jaw tight, his thoughts likely tangled in the same web of consequences and strategies. They'd won a skirmish, but the war was only beginning. As they reached the elevator, the metallic doors slid open with a soft chime, welcoming them into its sterile embrace. Jordan punched the button for the parking garage, then let out a sharp breath. Running a hand over his face, he turned to her, his eyes shadowed with a mix of resolve and dread. "I can't shake this feeling," he muttered, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the descending car. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." Miriam met his gaze, her expression unreadable but her eyes burning with quiet certainty. "That's because it will," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "They won't let this go unanswered. They'll push back, and when they do, they'll make sure the whole world sees it." Jordan let out a dry, brittle laugh, shaking his head. "You sound like you saw this coming a mile away." She tilted her head slightly, considering her response. "I did," she said, her voice calm but heavy with truth. "The system doesn't break clean. It doesn't fall apart quietly. It fights to survive." The elevator doors parted, revealing the cavernous parking garage, its air thick with the scent of oil and damp concrete. The distant rumble of engines echoed off the walls as they stepped out, their footsteps reverberating in the stillness. As they approached her car, Jordan hesitated, his gaze sweeping the shadows before he lowered his voice. "I've been thinking about what Vaughn said," he admitted, his tone reluctant but urgent. "About enemies we can't see." Miriam unlocked the car, her fingers tightening around the key fob as a flicker of tension rippled through her. Jordan exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. "And I don't like it," he continued, his voice dropping further. "Not just because it's true, but because it means we're walking blind into a fight we might not be ready for." She paused, turning to face him fully, her eyes locking onto his. "We've never been ready," she said, her voice steady, but laced with a hard-earned wisdom. "Not for any of this. But we keep going anyway. That's the only way justice wins by outlasting the corrupt." Jordan nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. Together, they climbed into the car, the engine roaring to life as they pulled out into the night. The city stretched before them, a sprawling battlefield of light and shadow, where every victory came at a cost and every step forward drew the noose tighter. They were in deeper now, tangled in a web of power and retribution, but they wouldn't stop. Not until the truth was laid bare, no matter how brutal the consequences. For in this fight, they had learned a bitter lesson. Justice was not a gift bestowed by the powerful. It was a prize wrested from their hands, paid for in courage and blood. And the abuse of that power, the arrogance of those who thought themselves untouchable, only fueled the fire that would one day consume them. Miriam and Jordan carried that fire now, a beacon in the dark, and they would see it burn until the end. The truth hung heavy in the air, a suffocating realization that they weren't just up against one rotten cop anymore. This was something far uglier, a sprawling, decades-old system, a fortress of power built to shield men like him, men who thrived in the shadows of its protection. And if Vaughn's gut was right, Miriam and Jordan had just painted massive targets on their backs, turning themselves into a thorn in the side of something vast and unforgiving. Miriam slipped into the driver's seat with a quiet determination, her fingers brushing the worn leather of the steering wheel as she settled in. Jordan followed, easing into the passenger side, his movements deliberate, almost hesitant. The second the doors thudded shut, the chaos of the outside world dulled to a distant hum, leaving them cocooned in a bubble of tension so thick it crackled between them. She clutched the wheel tightly, her knuckles paling under the strain, her eyes locked straight ahead as Jordan's words churned in her mind like a storm. She couldn't outrun. "You're right," she said finally, her voice low but steady, each syllable laced with the weight of what she'd just admitted. "We've become a problem for Theme, a real one. But that's exactly why we can't let up now." Jordan shifted in his seat, his gaze pinning her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Miriam, I'm not telling you to stop," he said, his tone careful, measured, like he was trying to navigate a minefield. "I'm saying we need to play this smart. If we charge into hard, too fast, it's not just lawsuits we'll be dodging. It'll be something darker, something that doesn't care about rules or badges." Her head turned then, slow and deliberate, meeting his eyes. Her face was a mask, unreadable even to him, but beneath it, a flicker of something raw stirred for. Maybe, or defiance, or both. "You're scared this is spiraling into something we can't control," she said. Not a question but a statement, cutting straight to the bone. He let out a dry, bitter laugh, the sound scraping against the quiet. "Miriam, it's already out of our hands." The truth landed like a stone between them, heavy and cold, sinking into the space where words failed. The air in the car thickened, charged with the electric hum of a moment that felt like crossing a line they couldn't uncross. She twisted the key in the ignition, and the engine growled to life, a low rumble that vibrated through the seats. "Then we keep doing what we've always done," she said, her voice firm, unshaken. We moved forward. Jordan watched her for a long beat, his eyes tracing the hard lines of her profile, searching for a crack in her resolve. Finally, he nodded, a quiet surrender. "All right," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost resigned. "But this time, Miriam, they're not just coming for the cause. They're coming for you." Her grip on the wheel tightened, just enough for the leather to creak under her fingers, but when she spoke, her tone was steel. "Let them try." They drove in silence for a while, the city unfurling around them in a blur of neon signs and shadowed corners. The streets pulsed with life, honking horns, flickering lights, the restless energy of a place oblivious to the war brewing beneath its surface. Jordan scrolled through his phone, the blue glow casting sharp angles across his face, illuminating the furrow in his brow. "It's everywhere," he muttered, his thumb flicking through endless headlines. Reynolds' arrest, the investigation tearing into the police department, old cases being reopened. He paused, his jaw tightening, and of course, the calls for your resignation. Miriam let out a slow breath through her nose, the sound sharp in the quiet. "That didn't take long, did it?" Jordan shook his head, frustration bleeding into his voice. "No, it didn't, and it's not just the usual suspects anymore. Some of these voice-thire people we thought were with us." She turned the car onto a quieter street, the clamor of the city fading to a distant murmur. "That's how it goes, Jordan," she said, her tone matter of fact, almost weary. "People stand by you until the ground starts shaking under their own feet. The second you threaten the system they're part of, even the so-called allies start running for cover." He sighed, dragging a hand through his hair, the gesture rough with exhaustion. "So what's the plan? Fight every fire they set?" Miriam's eyes stayed fixed on the road, her expression unwavering, a lighthouse in the storm. "No," she said simply. "We pick the battles that matter." The car slowed as she pulled up to a nondescript building, its plain brick facade blending into the night like a forgotten secret. Jordan frowned, glancing at her with a mix of curiosity and unease. "What's this place?" She killed the engine and unbuckled her seatbelt, the click loud in the stillness. "You'll see," she said, stepping out into the crisp night air. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she led the way, each step purposeful, resolute, while Jordan trailed behind, his senses on edge. The quiet Preston around them, thick with anticipation, the kind that made your skin prickle. At the door, Miriam knocked twice, sharp and precise, then stepped back. The door creaked open, revealing a man whose face bore the deep lines of a life spent in the margins. His eyes were cautious but not startled, sizing them up with the wariness of someone who'd seen too many wars unfold in the dark. His stance was steady, grounded, a silent testament to years of navigating treacherous waters. "Miriam Carter," he said, his voice a low rasp, tinged with something like reluctant respect. "Didn't expect you to show up here." She met his gaze without flinching. "I need information." He exhaled through his nose, a sound that carried both resignation and warning, then stepped aside. "Then you're in the right place." Jordan hesitated at the threshold, his eyes darting between Miriam and the man, a flicker of doubt tugging at him before he followed her in. The door thudded shut behind them, sealing them into a dimly lit room that smelled of stale paper and burnt coffee a sanctuary for secrets. Miriam sat across from the man, her posture straight, unyielding, while he slid a folder across the table. His fingers lingered on the edge, tapping a restless rhythm, as if silently asking if she was ready for the weight of what lay inside. She didn't hesitate. She already knew what she'd find: proof, names, a sprawling web of corruption that dwarfed Mark Reynolds, reaching into every corner of a system designed to protect itself. Taking a steadying breath, she flipped it open. Jordan stood behind her, arms crossed, his breathing slow and deliberate. Though his heart hammered in his chest, he'd been waiting for this moment. The fight shifted from whispers and exposes to something tangible, something they could wield. Miriam's eyes scanned the pages, her face a blank slate, but inside, a fire sparked, sharp and electric, searing through her veins. The corruption wasn't just deep, it was endless threads snaking through police precincts, city halls, corporate boardrooms, all woven into a machine that devoured anyone who dared challenge it. Reynolds had been a single gear, a small piece in a monstrous engine. His rest was a crack in the wall, but this folder, this was the deluge waiting to burst free. The man leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "This is bigger than you realize," he muttered, his voice rough with the weight of too many untold truths. "Bigger than Reynolds, bigger than the department. You take this public, and you're not just making enemies, you're painting bullseyes on your backs." Miriam didn't flinch, her gaze steady as stone. "That's what they're banking on, isn't it? Fear keeping everyone in line?" He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, slow and deliberate. "Yeah, and it works more times than it doesn't." Jordan let out a shaky breath, running a hand down his face, his composure fraying at the edges. "So what's our move?" His voice held steady, but the strain was there. The exhaustion of a man who'd fought too many battles and knew victory always came with scars. Miriam closed the folder, her fingers resting on its surface as she looked between them, her resolve unshaken. "We don't back off," she said, her words simple but ironclad. "We don't go silent, and we don't let them get the upper hand." Jordan let out a dry, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "Of course that's your answer." The man across from them chuckled too, but it was a hollow sound, devoid of mirth. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most reckless." Miriam's eyes locked with his, unflinching. "I'm both," she said, her voice a quiet thunder. "And that's why we're going to come out on top." The days that followed blurred into a whirlwind of chaos and defiance. The press latched onto the deeper investigation like hounds on a scent, headlines screaming with revelations of rot that stretched far beyond one disgraced officer. Protests erupted in the streets, raw and furious, fueled by communities who'd waited lifetimes for someone to rip the veil off the machinery that had crushed them for generations. Mark Reynolds, now rotting in a cell, found himself discarded by the very system he'd once trusted to save him. The police department scrambled, officials tripping over themselves to distance, deflect, rewrite the story before it spiraled further into the abyss. But the dam had already broken. Miriam's name was everywhere, a beacon to some, a threat to others, to those who'd been silenced. She was a force of nature, a woman who'd stared into the jaws of power and refused to blink. To the establishment, she was a wrecking ball, a destabilizer who dared expose truths meant to stay buried. Anonymous death threats arrived in plain envelopes, security tightened around her like a noose. But she pressed on unshaken. One by one, the cases Reynolds had tainted were pried open, wrongful convictions overturned. Men and women who'd languished in cages for crimes they never committed, stepping into the light again. Some had lost decades, their lives stolen by the hands of those sworn to uphold justice. Miriam met them face to face, sat with them in quiet rooms, listened as they poured out their stories, years of despair, of rage, of time that could never be reclaimed. Their voices haunted her, clung to her like shadows, driving her forward when the weight of it all threatened to pull her under. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about tearing down the corrupt, it was about lifting up the broken, giving voice to the voiceless. But the cost was steep. Power didn't crumble quietly, it lashed out, desperate to protect itself. And as the system bared its teeth, Miriam and Jordan stood firm. Knowing every step forward was a lesson in consequence of what happened. When you dared to challenge the untouchable, the evening air hung heavy with the weight of triumph and weariness. As Jordan slumped into the worn leather chair, a tumbler of amber liquid cradled in his calloused hand, shadows danced across his face, etching lines of exhaustion deeper into his brow. He swirled the drink absent-mindedly, the clink of ice against glass punctuating the silence. "We actually did it," he whispered, his voice rough, as if the words were still sinking into his soul. He tilted his head back, staring at the ceiling as though it might offer some confirmation of the impossible. "We tore it down." Across from him, Miriam perched on the edge of her seat, her fingers wrapped delicately round her own glass. She lifted it to the light, watching the way the liquid caught the faint glow of the room's single lamp, refracting it into a prism of golden hues. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, but her eyes remained sharp, unyielding. "Not all of it," she corrected, her tone measured yet firm, like a teacher gently scolding a student who'd missed the finer point. "Not yet." She took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the burn as it slid down her throat, then set the glass down with a soft thud that seemed to echo her resolve. Jordan's smirk flickered to life, a spark of amusement cutting through his fatigue. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" His words carried a mix of exasperation and admiration, a cocktail of emotions he'd long since stopped trying to untangle. Miriam's gaze met his, steady and unflinching, her silence a challenge in itself. He sighed, leaning back further into the chair, the creak of the leather underscoring his surrender. "No," he admitted after a beat, his voice softening with a rare vulnerability. "I wouldn't either." Meanwhile, miles away, in a sterile room bathed in the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, Reynolds sat hunched over a metal table. Once, he'd strode into courtrooms with the confidence of a king, his tailored suits and booming voice commanding respect or fear from all who crossed his path. Now, stripped of his title, his power, his legacy, he was a shadow of that man. The walls around him seemed to close in, their cold, unyielding surface a stark contrast to the plush offices he'd once ruled. His trial had been a whirlwind, a relentless storm of damning evidence, documents, recordings, testimonies that left no room for his usual bluster. The betrayal stung deepest, though. His own department, the very people he'd trusted to guard his back, had turned on him, offering him up as a sacrificial lamb, while the higher-ups scurried to protect their own gilded thrones. The last time Miriam saw him, he was behind a thick glass partition, his broad shoulders slumped, his once imposing frame diminished. Defeat clung to him like damp cloth, and yet his eyes still blazed with a fury that refused to turn inward. His fingers twitched nervously on the table, the restless energy of a caged animal, before curling into tight fists as if he could still punch his way out of this mess. When he spoke, his voice rasped like sandpaper, worn raw from nights spent shouting at the walls that wouldn't answer. "You think you won?" The question dripped with venom, a desperate grasp at defiance. Miriam tilted her head, studying him as one might a specimen under glass. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, but there was a steel beneath it that made the air between them crackle. "I don't think," she replied evenly, her words cutting through his bravado like a blade. "I know." His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing under sallow skin, his shoulders bearing the crushing weight of his own ruin. "They'll replace me," he muttered, his voice dropping to a bitter growl. "You know that, right? The system doesn't fall because of one man." She leaned in slightly, just enough to close the distance between them without breaking the barrier of glass. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, and for a moment, she saw the flicker of fear he'd spent a lifetime hiding. "No," she agreed, her voice soft but laced with an unshakable certainty. "But it starts with one." Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, a mirror of her own resolvestity, unbroken. A woman who'd faced down monsters and walked away taller. Without another word, she rose and turned, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space as she left him to stew in the prison of his own making, a place he'd once condemned so many others to without a second thought. Outside, the night air greeted her like an old friend, crisp and clean, washing away the stale bitterness of the visitation room. The sky stretched wide above, a vast canvas of stars that seemed to whisper promises of something greater. Jordan leaned against the car, his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes tracking her every move. The faint glow of a street lamp illuminated the lines of his face, revealing a mix of awe and quiet resignation. "So what now?" he asked, his voice low, tinged with the weight of all they'd endured. Miriam paused, drawing a deep breath that filled her lungs with the city's restless energy. She felt its pulse thrumming through her, a rhythm of struggle and hope intertwined. "Now," she said, her gaze lifting to the horizon, "we keep going." And that was the truth of justice, and not a single victorious moment, not a name struck from a ledger, but a ceaseless battle, a fire that demanded to be tended. Miriam Carter hadn't set out to be a beacon, hadn't dreamed of becoming anything more than a voice that refused to be muffled. Yet in that refusal, in her stubborn, unrelenting stand, she'd ignited something unstoppably, a ripple that swelled into a wave, crashing against the foundations of a world too long steeped in corruption. Across town, another story unfolded, one that would weave its own threads into the tapestry of justice and consequence. James Richardson stood alone on the weathered track of Central Valley High School, the early Saturday sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of dew-soaked grass, and the silence was broken only by the rhythmic thud of his sneakers against the cracked rubber surface. At 28, he was a man of quiet determination, his lean frame cutting through the morning mist as he ran sprint after sprint, stopwatch in hand. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his breath steady despite the exertion. This was his sanctuary, a ritual he'd kept for 3 years up at 5 a.m., a protein shake fueling his focus while the rest of the world slept. That morning felt no different at first. He'd warmed up with his usual laps, the familiar burn in his legs a comforting reminder of his purpose. His kids' youth track team he coached were counting on him for their meet the next weekend, and he'd be damned if he let them down. But then he noticed her, a woman in a white SUV parked near the track's entrance, her silhouette rigid behind the tinted glass. For nearly 20 minutes, she sat there, phone pressed to her ear, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that prickled the back of his neck. James shook it off, forcing himself to focus on his splits, but the unease lingered like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Then came the sirens. 2 police cruisers rolled into the lot, their lights slicing through the dawn with an urgency that turned his stomach. The woman, let's call her Karen, though her real name hardly mattered, had dialed 911, her voice trembling with self-righteous alarm as she reported a suspicious individual loitering at the school. "He's casing the place," she'd insisted to the dispatcher, her words dripping with the certainty of someone who'd appointed herself guardian of a community. She barely understood. "I've never seen someone like him around here before." She'd framed it as concern for school safety, but the venom in her tone betrayed something uglier. James stopped mid-stride as the officers approached, their boots crunching on the gravel. The small crowd of early morning dog walkers paused, leashes taut in their hands, their murmurs forming a low hum of curiosity. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, his chest rising and falling as he met their gaze. The exhaustion in his eyes wasn't from the run, it was the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd faced this scene too many times before. Karen stood off to the side, arms crossed, her lips pursed in a thin line of triumph as she waited for the officers to validate her fears. But then the unexpected happened. One of the officers, a burly man with a weathered face, broke into a wide, incredulous grin. The body camera footage captured it all. Karen's shrill insistence that James didn't belong, the tired slump of his shoulders as he braced for another round of scrutiny, and then the moment everything shifted. "Wait a second," the officer said, his voice cutting through the tension like a burst of sunlight. "You're James Richardson, aren't you?" 15 years earlier, that same track had been a different place, a crumbling relic of a struggling school, its surface pocked with weeds and neglect. Central Valley High was on its last legs back then, plagued by low funding and fading hope. But for 13-year-old James, it was a proving ground. Every morning, rain or shine, he'd lace up his worn sneakers and run, his skinny legs pumping with a determination that outstripped his circumstances. He wasn't on any team yet, too young, too poor, but he didn't need a coach to tell him he was fast. The track was his escape, his dream, his defiance against a world that seemed stacked against him. That boy grew into the man standing there now, a former track star who'd once brought glory to Central Valley High, whose name still graced the faded record board in the gym. He'd returned not just to train, but to give back, coaching kids who reminded him of his younger self, kids with big dreams and small chances. Karen didn't know that. She saw only a black man in a place she'd decided he didn't fit. Her call to the police a petty flex of power rooted in prejudice. The officer's grin widened as he turned to her. "Ma'am, this guy's a legend around here. He's got more right to be on this track than anyone." The words hit Karen like a slap, her face flushing as the crowd's murmurs turned to chuckles. James said nothing, his expression a mask of quiet dignity, but inside, a flicker of vindication burned bright. The footage went viral within hours, sparking a firestorm of debate online about bias, about belonging, about the cost of snap judgments. For Miriam and Jordan, justice was a war waged in courtrooms and shadows, a dismantling of power brick by brick. For James, it was a quieter victory, a moment of truth that exposed the fragility of authority built on ignorance. Both stories carried the same lesson. To abuse power is to invite its collapse, and from that ruin, something stronger can rise. As Miriam walked away from Reynolds, as James stood tall on that track, they embodied a truth as old as temporal justice isn't an end, but a beginning. A call to keep fighting, to keep running, no matter the odds. On a chilly Saturday morning, the air thick with the scent of dew-soaked grass, flashing police lights pierced the quiet of Central Valley High School's parking lot. A woman in an SUV, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped her phone, had just dialed 911, convinced she'd spotted a trespasser, black man lingering near the track at an hour when no one should be there. Her voice, sharp with indignation, had painted a picture of suspicion to the dispatcher, her words dripping with the certainty of someone who believed she was protecting her community. Little did she know, the man she'd singled out was no stranger to this place. His story was woven into the very soul of the school, a tale of grit, triumph, and a quiet rebellion against the forces that tried to dim his light, a story that would soon unravel before her eyes, leaving her to face the bitter sting of her own misjudgment. Years earlier, long before this tense morning standoff, a young James Richardson had stood at the edge of that same track, his sneakers worn thin from endless laps, his breath puffing out in small clouds against the dawn sky. He was a boy with a dream that burned brighter than the exhaustion in his legs, a vision of greatness that flickered in his chest even as his circumstances weighed heavy. His family lived in a cramped apartment just across the street, the kind of place where the walls seemed to hum with the struggles of survival. His mother, a woman with calloused hands and a spine of steel, juggled to grueling jobs and flipping burgers at the local diner, the other scrubbing office floors under flickering fluorescent lights. She couldn't afford the glossy training camps or private coaches that other kids flaunted, but she gave James something far more precious, a belief that sweat and perseverance could carve paths where money built walls. Every night, as she sank into their sagging couch, she'd look at him with tired eyes that still sparked with pride and say, "You keep running, baby. You keep running, and the world will have to catch up." James wasn't alone in his pursuit. There was Mr. Thompson, the school's grizzled janitor, a man whose face was etched with lines of hard-earned wisdom, and whose hands bore the scars of decades spent keeping the place running. He saw something in Jamessa's spark, a hunger that others missed. Every morning, before the sun had even peeked over the horizon, Mr. Thompson would shuffle out in his faded overalls, keys jangling at his hip, and unlock the gates just for that skinny kid with the wild dreams. That boy, he'd rasp to anyone who'd stop long enough to listen, his voice thick with conviction. "He's gonna make this school something special someday." To James, those words were a lifeline, a quiet promise that his efforts weren't invisible. As he pounded the track, the old man's faith fueled him, each step a defiance against a world that didn't expect much from a kid like him. By the time James strode into Central Valley High as a freshman, his lanky frame carried the weight of countless pre-dawn hours. The track wasn't just a strip of rubber to him, it was a proving ground, a sanctuary where the rhythm of his footsteps drowned out the noise of doubt. Teachers pulling into the parking lot at sunrise would spot him through their fogged-up windows, a solitary figure cutting through the mist, and they'd wave, their sleepy smiles a nod to the kid who'd become a fixture in their morning routines. He wasn't just another student-athlete chasing a varsity letter. He was stitching himself into the school's heartbeat, a thread of determination that held tight even as life threw its punches. And punch it did. In James's sophomore year, the air grew heavy with whispers of budget cuts. The school board, a group of stern faces in ill-fitting suits, gathered in a fluorescent-lit room and declared the track and field program expendably a luxury they couldn't justify for a facility they deemed half-empty. The news hit James like a sucker punch, his stomach twisting as he imagined the gates locked for good, his dreams crumbling under the weight of bureaucracy. But where others saw defeat, James saw a fight, with a fire in his gut and a clipboard in hand. He started organizing community track meets every Saturday. Picture it, a lanky teenager with a megaphone, corralling neighborhood kids onto the track, his voice steady as he taught them how to plant their feet, how to push off the blocks, how to chase a finish line like it was theirs to claim. He timed their sprints with an old stopwatch, its cracked face a gift from Mr. Thompson, and cheered them on as they stumbled and soared, their laughter echoing across the field. What began with a handful of curious kids kicking up dust soon swelled into something unstoppable. Dozens showed up, their sneakers scuffing the track, their eyes wide with possibility. Parents trailed behind, dragging lawn chairs and coolers stuffed with sodas and sandwiches, their chatter filling the air with a warmth the school board could never quantify. Local businesses caught wind of it. Patel from the corner store dropped off water bottles. The diner where James's mom worked sent over trays of muffins, and suddenly, that underutilized track was buzzing with life. It wasn't just a place to run anymore. It was a gathering spot, a heartbeat for a community that had found its rhythm in the vision of a kid who wouldn't let go. At the center stood James, his quiet resolve a beacon, proving that power misused by those at the top could be undone by the hands of those willing to build something better. By his senior year, James's name was etched in state record books 3 times over, each victory a thunderclap of proof that he was unstoppable. A full college scholarship landed in his lap, a golden ticket out of the apartment complex and into a world his mother had only dreamed of for him. But that wasn't what made him a legend at Central Valley High. It was the way he carried his success, not as a crown to wear, but as a torch to pass. Every break from college, he'd return to that track, his old sneakers sinking into the familiar rubber, and he'd spend hours with the younger athletes. Picture him crouched beside a nervous middle schooler, adjusting her stance, or leaning against the fence, spinning tales of college meets to a cluster of kids who hung on his every word, their eyes mirroring the dreams he'd once cradled. He didn't just show them how to run faster. He showed them how to believe deeper. After college, when most would have chased brighter lights and bigger stages, James chose home. The city's gleaming arenas and elite training centers didn't call to him the way that weathered track did. He took a job that raised eyebrows among those who'd watched him soar a roll, that tethered him to the school where his story began, a position that let him plant seeds in the hearts of kids who reminded him of himself. And so, on that fateful Saturday morning, as the police lights flashed and the woman in the Savlays call her Karen clutched her phone, with righteous fury, the stage was set for a reckoning she couldn't have foreseen. The officer, his badge glinting in the early light, struggled to keep his composure, a smirk tugging at his lips as Karen ranted about the suspicious man she'd spotted. He knew what she didn't, that the figure she'd pegged as an intruder was a cornerstone of this place, a man whose presence was as natural as the sunrise. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights, parents dropping off kids for practice, a few curious neighbors peering over the fencing they watched, hushed, as the scene unfolded. This wasn't going to be a shouting match or a dramatic arrest. No, this was justice arriving on tiptoe, a quiet unveiling that would hit harder than any gavel. Just then, a car rolled into the lot, tires crunching gravel. Out stepped Principal Martinez, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her coat flapping in the breeze as she strode toward the commotion. Her eyes landed on James, and a grin broke across her face, warm and unguarded. "James," she called. her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I thought I might find you here." Karen's head snapped up, her certainty faltering as she watched the principal greet this trespasser like an old friend. The pieces weren't adding up, and the unease creeping into her chest was palpable to misread the board. And the game was about to flip. Principal Martinez turned to Karen, her tone steady but laced with an edge. "Mum, did you know Central Valley High has one of the top track programs in the state?" Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. 5 years ago, we were days away from losing it all. Now, we're sending kids to championships every year. And you know who made that happen? She gestured toward James, who stood calm and still, his arms crossed, that old stopwatch dangling from his neck, a relic of Mr. Thompson's faith, a symbol of the miles he'd run to get here. Karen's gaze darted to him, her righteousness crumbling as the officer's camera captured every flicker of doubt, crossing her face. But the story ran deeper still, a layer of irony so rich it almost glittered. Just 2 days earlier, the local paper had splashed James's face across its front page, not for his records or his scholarship, but for something bigger. He'd started Dawn Runners, a program born from the quiet moments he'd spent watching kids from his old apartment complex press their faces against the fence, their parents gone to early shifts, their mornings empty of direction. James had seen himself in them hunger the potential, and he'd acted. At 6 a.m., he'd swing open the gates, just as Mr. Thompson once had, and welcome them onto the track. He didn't just teach them to sprint. He sat with them over textbooks, talked about college essays, showed them how the discipline of a runner could carry them anywhere. The program was a lifeline, a ripple that spread across the district, catching the eye of educators statewide. And right there, where Karen saw a threat, dozens of kids were finding their futures. As Principal Martinez spoke, more cars pulled in, parents and kids arriving for Saturday practice, their faces shifting from confusion to concern at the sight of the police. Among them was Marcus, a freshman with a loping stride and a shy smile, a kid who could have been James's shadow from years past. His mom, a nurse who worked dawn shifts, had entrusted him to James's mornings, and for 6 months, Marcus had shown up, soaking in every lesson from the man who'd walked his road first. The crowd swelled, parents who'd cheered at James's meets, kids who idolized him, neighbors who'd pitched in for his track days, and they stood witness to this clash of prejudice and truth. Karen's discomfort was a living thing now, her hands tightening around her phone as the situation slipped from her grasp. The suspicious man she'd called out was no outsider, was known, loved, revered. But she didn't know the half of it. Principal Martinez turned to the crowd, ready to drop the final piece, when a figure emerged from the field's edge. Mr. Thompson, retired but never far, shuffled forward, his steps slow but sure, drawn by the commotion. In his gnarled hands, he held an old photo, a faded shot of a 13-year-old James, grinning beside the janitor who'd unlocked his world. James's stoic mask cracked, a smile breaking through, bright and unguarded. If anyone understood the poetry of this moment, it was Mr. Thompson, the man who'd seen the boy before the legend. The revelation hung in the air. James Richardson wasn't just a runner or a mentor. He was Central Valley High's track coach, a role he'd taken to stay rooted where he'd grown, to lift up the next generation. Karen's call, her snap judgment, had summoned not punishment but a mirror, reflecting the cost of power wielded without care. As the crowd murmured and the officer's camera rolled, justice landed, not loud, not vengeful, but undeniable. It was a lesson etched in the morning light. Assumptions could build walls, but the truth and the work of those like James could tear them down. The morning sun spilled golden light across the weathered track at Central Valley High School, illuminating a scene that buzzed with tension and anticipation. A crowd of parents, students, and onlookers had gathered, their murmurs rising like a tide as they formed a loose semicircle around Karen. She stood there, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her earlier bravado evaporating into the crisp air. Her phone, once clutched tightly as she dialed the police with unshakable certainty, now lay buried in her pocket, a silent witness to her growing unease. She had been so sure of herself, convinced that the man standing on the track didn't belong there, that he was an intruder disrupting the sanctity of her community. But now, as the weight of curious eyes pressed down on her, doubt crept in, curling around her thoughts like smoke. In the center of it all stood James Richardson, his posture calm and steady, a quiet strength radiating from him despite the chaos swirling around. His dark eyes carried a patient wisdom, the kind forged through years of perseverance, and his lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Beside him, Mr. Thompson, the school janitor whose weary frame belied his enduring spirit, held up an old photograph. Its edges were frayed, softened by time, and the countless hands that had admired it over the years. The picture had hung proudly in the school's main hallway for over a decade, a relic of a moment frozen 15 years ago. In it, a young James stood on this very track, his thin frame almost dwarfed by the gleaming metal clutched in his handis. First track meet victory. Next to him was a younger Mr. Thompson, his face alight with pride, his arms slung around the boy's shoulders in a gesture of unshakable belief. The headline beneath the photo, etched into a plaque in the school's trophy case, read, "From Dawn Runner to Legend, the journey begins." It wasn't just a memory captured in faded ink, it was a testament to something deeper. A story of trust, resilience, and the quiet power of second chances. The crowd leaned in, their breaths visible in the chilly morning air. As Principal Martinez stepped forward, her presence commanded attention, her sharp gaze softened by a warmth that spoke of her devotion to this school. She adjusted her scarf against the breeze and addressed the group, her voice steady but rich with emotion. When the school board set out to fill this position, she began, her eyes flickering briefly to Karen. They scoured the country for candidates, people with decades of experience, polished resumes, and connections to the biggest athletic programs you could imagine. She paused, letting the words settle, her gaze locking onto Karen with deliberate intent. But sometimes, the right person isn't the one with the flashiest credentials. Sometimes, it's the one who knows the soul of a place who has felt its hardships, dreamed its dreams, and fought to make them real. Karen's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line as the principal's words landed like stones. She shifted again, her sneakers scuffing the gravel, and for a moment, her eyes darted to the ground as if searching for an escape. She didn't know the full story yet, not the part that would make her impulsive call to the police feel like a glaring misstep, a lesson in the peril of snap judgments. Around her, the morning unfolded in vivid detail, the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the track where James had poured his life's work. This was the same cracked oval where he'd trained as a teenager, his sneakers pounding the uneven surface until his legs burned and his lungs ached. It was where he'd shattered state records, where he'd returned years later to guide others, and now, where he faced a woman who'd mistaken his quiet presence for something sinister. From the edge of the crowd, a small figure stepped forward. Sophia, a seventh grader with a spark in her eyes and a track jacket emblazoned with the same design James had worn all those years ago. Her voice cut through the murmurs, clear and unshaken. "Show her the wall," she said, her tone carrying a confidence beyond her years. The other kids nodded, their faces lighting up with shared understanding. They knew what she meant. Mural inside the school's athletic center, a sprawling masterpiece of color and memory. It told a story that began with a crumbling track and a boy who refused to give up, a tale that stretched far beyond what anyone could have foreseen. The wall was more than art, it was a monument to transformation, a reminder of how one person's resolve could ripple outward, reshaping a community. For Karen, who'd pegged James as an outsider, the irony of that story would soon sting like salt in a wound. Mr. Thompson, still cradling the photograph, turned to Karen. His voice was soft but resonant, threaded with the weight of experience. "Would you like to see where this boy ended up?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Would you like to know why he's here every Saturday morning? Why these kids look up to him? Why Principal Martinez trusts him with our school's future?" There was no malice in his tone, only a gentle invitation to understand. Behind him, the two police officers who'd arrived at Karen's call exchanged grins, their relaxed postures a stark contrast to her earlier urgency. They'd recognized James from the moment they pulled up. His name was a quiet legend in these parts, and their amusement was palpable, though they kept their silence, content to watch the scene unfold. Just then, the rumble of a bus broke the stillness, its tires crunching over the parking lot gravel. Through its dusty windows, the silhouettes of more students emerged, clad in track uniforms, the varsity team arriving for their weekend practice. As they spilled out, their voices rose in a chorus of greetings, each one directed at James with a mix of reverence and warmth. A lanky boy with a shy smile clapped him on the shoulder, while a girl with braided hair flashed a thumbs up, her eyes bright with admiration. It was clear he wasn't just a coach to them, he was a mentor, a cornerstone, a living proof that dreams could take root even in the hardest soil. Principal Martinez glanced at her watch, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's almost time," she said, her voice carrying a hint of anticipation. She turned to James. "Would you like to tell her yourself, or should I?" James shook his head, that same patient smile holding steady. He understood that some lessons were most powerful when they unfolded on their own, like a flower opening to the sun. With a nod, the principal reached into her bag and pulled out a document, its crisp edges catching the light. It was more than just paper, it was an answer, a key that would unlock the truth of why James belonged here, transforming this moment from a near misunderstanding into a profound reckoning about justice, prejudice, and the consequences of wielding power without pause. As she unfolded it, the breeze carried the sound of more cars pulling in, their engines humming as the parking lot filled with families arriving for the weekend track meet. The air thrummed with energy, the day taking on a weight it hadn't held before. Then, a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop, its tires whispering against the asphalt. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped Dr. Michael Chen, the district superintendent, his polished shoes gleaming in the sunlight. His arrival sent a ripple through the crowd, heads turning, whispers sharpening. Karen's face drained of color, her breath catching as she recognized him from countless school board meetings, where she'd sat in the front row, her voice loud with opinions about community standards and proper oversight. But Dr. Chen wasn't alone. Behind him emerged a camera crew from the local news station, their equipment glinting as they fanned out across the lot. They'd come to cover the track meet for a reason that now felt almost fated, a twist that elevated this morning into something extraordinary. Sarah Jenkins, the reporter, adjusted her mic, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She'd expected a routine story, kids running laps, a feel-good segment for the evening broadcast, but the flashing police lights, the growing crowd, and the tension hanging thick in the air told her she'd stumbled into something far bigger. Principal Martinez caught Dr. Chen's eye, a silent understanding passing between them before she turned back to Karen. "You see," she said, her voice rising above the murmurs, "we were going to announce it at today's meet. The school board voted unanimously last week." She gestured toward James, who stood unwavering amid the chaos, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "But since you're so concerned about who has the right to be here," she trailed off, letting the implication hang. At that moment, Marcus, a freshman from the Dawn Runners program, pushed through the crowd, his sneakers scuffing the dirt. In his hands was a glossy magazine edition, today its cover featuring a familiar track, their track. The headline blazed in bold letters, "From Community Crisis to National Model. How one school's athletic program became a blueprint for change." Karen's eyes widened, her breath hitching as she took in the image of James on the cover, his steady gaze a quiet rebuke to her assumptions. The article inside wove a tale that was nothing short of remarkable. It chronicled how Central Valley High's Dawn Runners program had risen from the ashes of a struggling school, how a young man who'd once begged for a chance to run on a broken track had turned it into a beacon of hope. It detailed the countless hours James had spent mentoring kids like Sophia and Marcus, the way he'd channeled his own struggles into a vision that caught the eye of educators nationwide. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, addressing Karen directly for the first time, "I assume you received the community newsletter last week." The irony dripped from his words, and Karen's hand twitched toward her purse, where that unread newsletter likely still sat, its front-page story holding the very truth she'd overlooked. The news crew's cameras rolled, capturing the surreal tabloopaless cars idling with their lights flashing, students and parents clustering closer, and James standing at the heart of it all. the track stretching out behind him like a lifeline. Mr. Thompson moved again, this time pulling out not just one photo, but a whole stack, his hands trembling slightly with the weight of what they represented. "Before you see that document," he said to Karen, his voice steady but insistent, "I think you should understand the full story." He spread the pictures across the hood of a police car, each one a chapter in a journey. A young boy running alone on a fractured track, his face etched with determination. A high school athlete crossing the finish line, sweat streaking his brow. A college graduate returning to coach, his eyes bright with purpose. The final photo stopped Karen cold. It was taken just last week, in a school boardroom she knew well, a place where she'd often argued against change. In it, James shook hands with Dr. Chen, both men beaming beneath a banner that read, "Central Valley High welcomes its new athletic director." The crowd held its breath as another car pulled in, its door opening to reveal Mayor Garcia. She wasn't just a city official, she was a Central Valley alum, one of James's first dawn runners from 15 years ago. Her steps were purposeful as she crossed the lot, her dark hair catching the sunlight. She reached James and enveloped him in a warm hug, then turned to Karen with a look that was equal parts kindness and steel. "I see you've met our new athletic director and assistant principal," she said, her voice carrying a quiet power. The words landed like a thunderclap, and Karen's eyes widened, her hands clenching at her sides as the pieces snapped into place. But the revelations weren't done. Principal Martinez raised the document in her hands, its pages fluttering in the breeze. "As of next month," she announced, her voice ringing out across the now silent lot, "Central Valley High School will become the state center for athletic excellence." With James Richardson as its founding executive director, the crowd erupted into cheers, students whooping and parents clapping, their pride swelling like a wave. Karen stood frozen, her earlier certainty crumbling beneath the weight of what she'd just witnessed. A lesson in justice, in the consequences of unchecked power, and in the quiet strength of a man who'd turned adversity into triumph. As the track meet began, the air buzzed with a new energy, the day forever marked by what had unfolded. James returned to the sidelines, his focus shifting back to the kids he'd dedicated his life to, while Karen slipped quietly into the crowd, her silence a testament to the humbling power of truth. For Central Valley, this wasn't just a victory on the track, it was a reminder that true authority comes not from assumptions, but from understanding, and that the misuse of power carries a cost that echoes far beyond the moment it's wielded. The air buzzed with anticipation, that crisp Saturday morning, as the news crew jostled for the perfect shot, their cameras trained on Karen. Her face was a kaleidoscope of emotion. First came the wide-eyed shock, as if the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. Then, a flush of embarrassment crept up her neck, painting her cheeks a vivid red as she realized the enormity of her mistake. Finally, her expression softened into something deeper, something remorse, genuine and unguarded, shimmering in her tear-brimmed eyes. She had called in a report about a suspicious figure lurking near Central Valley High School's track, expecting to be hailed as a vigilant hero. Instead, the man she'd singled out wasn't some shadowy intruder. He was James Richard Santel, steady and unassuming school's athletic director, a nationally celebrated educator, and the mastermind behind a program set to ripple through the lives of countless students. Across the state, the track stretched out before them, its faded lines etched into the earth like the veins of a living thing. It was more than just a loop of weathered rubber, it was a proving ground, a sanctuary where sweat and determination forged dreams into reality. James didn't linger on Karen's unraveling. He turned instead to the crowd of students gathered around him as dawn runners, the varsity team with their restless energy, and the younger kids who'd stumbled out of bed for early practice, their sneakers scuffing the dirt. His voice cut through the morning chill, calm and resolute. "This track," he said, gesturing to the expanse before them, "has never been just about running. It's where we shape who we want to become, where we shatter the walls holding us back, and where we learn that the only limits that truly matter are the ones we build in our own minds." The words hung in the air, simple yet electric, igniting a spark in the eyes of the kids who looked up at him not just as a coach, but as a beacon. Then came the moment that stopped everyone cold, even Principal Martinez. who stood off to the side with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze softened by surprise. James stepped toward Karen. She shrank back instinctively, her shoulders hunching as if she could melt into the earth and escape the weight of her misjudgment. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, nails digging into her palms. But James didn't hesitate. "Would you like to join us for practice this morning?" he asked, his hand outstretched, steady and open. "Come see for yourself what we're building here." His voice was gentle, not a trace of accusation in it, only an invitation. The crowd fell silent, the hum of the news crew's equipment the only sound breaking the stillness. Karen blinked, caught off guard, her mind racing. This wasn't what she'd expected: danger, maybe, or cold dismissal. Instead, here was a man offering her a lifeline, a chance to step out of the shadow of her own error. Those who knew James weren't shocked. This was the essence of why he'd been tapped to lead the state's new athletic initiative vision. That turned conflict into connection, mistakes into stepping stones. Karen hesitated, her breath shallow, then reached out. Her trembling fingers brushed his, and she took his hand, a tentative bridge forming between them. As she did, Mr. Thompson shuffled forward from the edge of the crowd. The retired janitor, with his weary frame and weathered hands, had been a quiet fixture at the school for decades. He clutched a photograph, its edges worn from years of careful handling. It was the latest addition to the school's growing collection, a shot of James at his appointment ceremony as athletic director, standing tall on this very track where he'd once been a scrappy kid with big dreams. Beneath it, in bold letters, were words he'd spoken that day: "Every morning brings a new chance to rewrite your story." Mr. Thompson's eyes crinkled with pride as he handed it over, his voice raspy but warm. "Always knew you'd make something of this place, James." The cameras caught an alt glint of tears as Karen grasped the depth of her blunder, the quiet pride radiating from James's students as they watched their mentor rise above the moment, and the subtle shift when suspicion crumbled into something hopeful. But the morning wasn't done unfolding. As the crowd buzzed and the track meet preparations kicked into gear, Mayor Garcia stepped up to the makeshift podium, her navy blazer crisp against the dawn light. Her voice boomed with authority. "After today's events," she announced, "the City Council has voted unanimously to rename this facility." A ripple of excitement swept through the gathering as workers unveiled a gleaming new sign: "The James Richardson Center for Athletic Excellence, where every dawn brings new dreams." The words shimmered in the sunlight, a testament to a legacy built not on bitterness, but on belief. Later, as the sun climbed higher, bathing the track in golden warmth, James led his usual Saturday training session. The rhythm of pounding feet and steady breaths filled the air, unbroken by the morning's drama. But now, Karen lingered on the bleachers, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched. The kids darted past, their faces alive with purpose, and she felt a pang regret mingled with a fragile flicker of resolve. She'd approached Principal Martinez after the ceremony, her voice small but firm. "I want to help," she'd said. "I want to be part of this, not stand in its way." Martinez, a woman of few words but sharp instincts, had nodded, assigning her a spot on the athletic advisory board. There, on the track where it all began, a simple run had spiraled into a profound reckoning, a lesson in justice, in the cost of unchecked assumptions, and in the quiet power of second chances. The story didn't end with that Saturday sunrise. It spread like wildfire, racing through social media and news outlets, not as a tired tale of profiling gone wrong, but as a vivid portrait of resilience and redemption. The video of Karen's confrontation with James exploded online, but it wasn't the outrage that carried it. It was the aftermath: way James turned a moment of division into a bridge, the way Karen stepped forward instead of shrinking back. She didn't vanish into the background after that day. At the next school board meeting, she stood before a packed room, her hands gripping the podium. "I thought I was protecting our school," she said, her voice quaking but resolute. "But I was blocking its greatest strength. I misjudged James, and I'm sorry. Now I want to help build what he's started." The room was silent for a beat, then erupted in applause, not mocking, but earnest, as if they, too, saw the chance for something new. The Dawn Runners program swelled overnight. What began with a handful of kids lacing up their shoes in the pre-dawn gloom ballooned into a movement, Other schools took notice, reaching out to James for guidance. Their own tracks springing to life with the same ethos, perseverance, possibility, and the breaking of invisible chains. The track at Central Valley, once slated for demolition, became a symbol, a worn oval of rubber and grit that stood for something bigger. Mr. Thompson, now a regular at morning practices, hauled a thermos of coffee for the parents who braved the early hours to watch their kids train. He'd perch on the bleachers, his eyes misty as he recounted tales of a 13-year-old James, skinny and relentless, pounding the pavement years ago. That boy never quit, he'd say, chuckling. Look at him now. His old photo of James's first medal win, a blurry snapshot of a triumphant grin, had been blown up and framed, hanging proudly in the school's hallway beside the current team's trophies. A bridge between past and present. Mayor Garcia seized the moment, launching a citywide initiative called Dawn of Understanding. The first event unfolded right there on the track, with James and Karen standing side by side, greeting a diverse crowd: parents, shopkeepers, teens, retirees drawn together to dismantle old divides. The students felt it most of all. Marcus, a weary freshman with James's same restless spark, found his footing in the program. 3 months later, at the state championships, he didn't just edge out James's old record, he obliterated it, his legs a blur as the crowd roared. Afterward, panting and beaming, he told a reporter, "Coach James showed me my dreams aren't crazy. They're real." That clip made it into the documentary Dawn's Light, the James Richardson story, a film that traced not just one morning, but a community's arc from prejudice to pride. James's mother, still flipping pancakes at the local diner, wiped her hands on her apron during her interview, her voice thick with emotion. "He's my boy," she said, "but he's theirs too." Principal Martinez wove the lesson into the school's fabric, starting a tradition. Every graduating class, athletes or not, took a final lap around the track together. It wasn't about speed, it was about the journey, about learning to see past snap judgments and embrace the messy, beautiful truth of each other. James kept his promise, there every morning as he'd been for 15 years, his sneakers hitting the track with the same quiet determination. But now, he had company. Karen joined the walks, as did other parents, teachers, even strangers who found in that oval a place where differences faded, where the rising sun lit a shared path. The James Richardson Center became a blueprint for reform, proof that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about growth, about the courage to face consequences and rebuild. Schools nationwide called, eager to replicate the magic of a program born from a near-forgotten track. A year later, Central Valley hosted an anniversary event. The dawn air was cool as hundreds gathered, students, families, educators leading them in a slow lap, Karen at his side. They passed the spot where police lights had once flashed, now just a memory softened by time. Her smile met his, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they'd come. James's words to his runners echoed through it all. The track doesn't care who you are or where you're from. It's what you do with it that counts. Every morning, new faces joined the Dawn runners, drawn not just to train, but to be part of a story where misunderstanding sparked meaning, where the fallout of power misused became a call to rise higher. The sun climbed over Central Valley High, casting long shadows across the track, a testament not to speed or records, but to the strength of showing up, the wisdom of learning, and the grace of lifting others along the way. That, James knew, was the race worth running. The air inside the Metropolitan Police Department's conference room buzzed with anticipation, a stark contrast to the stillness that had defined Captain Carmen Rodriguez's 20 years of service. Today wasn't just another day, it was the day she'd etch her name into the city's history. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing Mayor Thompson's broad, welcoming grin. "Captain Rodriguez, please come in," he said, his voice warm yet commanding as he waved her into a room teeming with city officials and journalists. Carmen's chest tightened with a mix of nerves and pride. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself as her black heels clicked rhythmically against the gleaming hardwood floor, each step echoing her resolve. In the front row, her teenage daughter Maria sat beside her husband Robert, their faces alight with uncontainable joy. Maria's small thumbs up a gesture, rooted in years of morning school drop-off, sent a wave of warmth through Carmen, softening the edges of her anxiety. Robert's steady gaze anchored her, a silent promise of support forged over to decades of shared dreams and struggles. As she took her place at the center of the room, the murmur of the crowd faded, and Mayor Thompson's voice rose above the hush. "Today is a turning point for our city," he declared, his words carrying a weight that filled the space. "After a meticulous search, we've chosen not only the most exceptional candidate, but also a trailblazer, the first black female chief of police in our history." Carmen stood taller, her shoulders squared as the mayor recited her accomplishments, graduating at the pinnacle of her police academy class, dedicating 15 years to community outreach, earning a master's degree in criminal justice, and slashing crime rates in every district she'd overseen. Yet amidst the accolades, one memory glowed brightest: a handwritten letter from Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman from her early patrol days. The note praised Carmen for guiding her grandson away from the pull of gang life and into the halls of a college campus. That small, fragile piece of paper, now tucked away in her desk, was worth more to her than any medal pinned to her uniform. When the oath was complete, Carmen stepped to the podium, her heart pounding a fierce rhythm. The sea of faces before her shimmered with familiarity and curiosity. Friends, family, and a cluster of officers from Precinct 23, her new domain, seated in the back. Their expressions flickered with unease, a subtle tension she couldn't ignore. These were men and women unaccustomed to a leader like her, their skepticism etched into furrowed brows and tight-lipped stares. "I stand here today not just as your new chief of police," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "but as someone who grew up on the very streets we serve. I know the chill of fear that runs through you when a patrol car looms in your mirror, even when your hands are clean. And I know the weight of this badge of courage it demands to face danger. For the sake of our community." She paused, her eyes locking with theirs, a silent vow passing between them. "Precinct 23 has its struggles. Trust between our officers and the people we protect has frayed. Change won't come swiftly, but mark my words, it will come." Later, alone in her new office, Carmen sat behind a desk bearing a nameplate that read Chief Carmen Rodriguez. Her fingers traced the edges of a framed photo from her first day as a rookie, her younger self staring back with wide eyes brimming with terror and tenacity. 20 years had carved lines into her face, but that same fire still burned within her, now fueled by a deeper purpose. She flipped open her laptop, the screen casting a soft glow across the room as she pored over Precinct 23's files. The numbers painted a grim picture: disproportionate traffic stops targeting minorities, a stack of unresolved complaints about officer behavior, and community trust scores plummeting like stones into a well. Top-down decrees wouldn't fix this. She knew she needed to feel the pulse of her precinct, to see its truths unfiltered. Picking up her phone, she dialed Robert. "I'll be late next week," she said, her mind already mapping out a plan. "I need to see how things really run out there before I shake anything up." Robert chuckled, his voice a familiar balm after 23 years of marriage. "Undercover in your own precinct," he teased, reading her like an open book. "Not quite," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "Just observing. Plain clothes, my own car. I want to know how our officers act when they don't realize the chief's watching." As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in hues of amber and shadow, Carmen gathered her belongings. Tomorrow marked her official first day, but next week, the real work would begin. Before leaving, she set her mother's weathered Bible on the desk, its leather cover soft beneath her fingers. Tucked inside was a faded photo of her mother in her nurse's uniform, a woman who'd shattered her own ceilings decades ago. "We're going to make a difference here, Mama," Carmen whispered, brushing the image tenderly. One step at a time. A week later, the evening air brushed cool against her skin as Carmen navigated her black BMW through Precinct 23's streets. Dressed in a simple blue sweater and black pants, her badge and ID stowed discreetly in her purse, she blended into the night like any other resident. The dashboard clock glowed 9:45 p.m. For 3 hours, she'd crisscrossed neighborhoods, her sharp eyes tracking patrol cars as they roamed. Some blocks bristled with police presence, their lights slicing through the dark, while others lay eerily quiet. She noted how officers' demeanors shifted brusque and guarded on one street, lax and indifferent on another. As she eased onto Maple Street, a sudden flash of blue and red erupted in her rearview mirror. Her pulse quickened, though her hands remained steady on the wheel. A glance at the speedometer confirmed she was within the limit. Her signals worked. Her registration current. A wry smile flickered across her face as she pulled to the curb. This could be the window she'd been waiting for. Two officers approached, their silhouettes stark against the patrol car's pulsing lights. Officer Mike Thompson took the driver's side, his flashlight beam cutting through her window with an intensity that felt excessive. For the well-lit street, Officer Steve Chen flanked the passenger side, his own light trained on her face. Thompson's hand hovered near his holster, a routine precaution, but his stance carried an edge of unwarranted alertness. "License and registration," Thompson barked, skipping any greeting. His tone was clipped, his eyes narrowing as if he'd already sized her up. Carmen kept her hands visible, resting lightly on the wheel. "Good evening, officer," she said evenly. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" Chen chimed in, his flashlight unwavering. "Your right taillight looks dim. License and registration, please. Is this your car, ma'am?" Carmen's mind reset. Her taillights were flawless. She'd checked them herself the day before. And that question about the car's ownership slipped in so casually, carried a weight she recognized all too well. "I'm reaching for my registration," she announced, her voice deliberate as she moved slowly toward the glove compartment. Both officers stiffened, their tension palpable. She retrieved the documents and handed them over, watching through her side mirror as they retreated to their cruiser, their heads bent over a computer screen, their voices a low murmur she couldn't decipher. Slipping her phone from her purse, she jotted down their badge numbers and the patrol car's ID, her fingers steady despite the growing weight. 5 minutes stretched into 10. A taillight check shouldn't take this long. She knew they were digging deeper, running a background check that far exceeded standard protocol. When they returned, Thompson's demeanor had shifted, softened by whatever they'd found. "Mrs. Rodriguez, can you step out of the vehicle?" he asked, his voice smoother now, likely influenced by her address in one of the city's upscale neighborhoods. "Is there a problem, officer?" she replied, unbuckling her seatbelt with measured calm. "Just step out, please. We need to verify some information," Chen added, his flashlight still piercing the night. As she opened the door and stood, narrating her actions, "I'm getting out now," she caught the subtle shift of their hands toward their weapons, a reflex that spoke volumes. Thompson's next question came laced with suspicion. "Can you explain how you afford this vehicle? We've had reports of stolen luxury cars in the area." It was a flimsy leak. Carmen knew no such reports existed. She'd reviewed the precinct's logs herself. Chen shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the ground as if he sensed the absurdity of his partner's words. "I can explain everything," Carmen said, her tone steady as she reached for her purse. Instantly, both officers braced, Thompson's voice snapping, "Keep your hands where we can see them." She paused, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Officers, I'm reaching for my credentials. I think you'll find them enlightening." Time seemed to stretch thin in that moment, the patrol car's lights casting rhythmic shadows across the brick facades lining Maple Street. Carmen stood poised between the two men, her badge resting just inches away in her purse. She thought of Mrs. Jenkins' grandson, of her mother's quiet strength, of the countless faces in Precinct 23 waiting for justice to mean something more than power misused. This wasn't just about these officers, it was about a system that had grown careless, about consequences that had gone unchecked for too long. As her fingers closed around her badge, she knew this encounter would ripple far beyond this night, a lesson in accountability that would reshape her precinct from the ground up. Justice, she mused, wasn't a gift bestowed, it was a garden cultivated, one careful step at a time. The night air hung heavy with tension, a faint blue glow tinting the faces of everyone involved in the unfolding scene. Officer Thompson stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his voice slicing through the quiet street with a sharpness Carmen knew all too well from her years on the force. "Ma'am, I'll ask you one more time, what's in your purse?" His tone carried the weight of authority, but beneath it, Carmen sensed a flicker of unease, as if he were testing her resolve. She stood calmly by her sleek BMW, the cool metal of the car pressing against her back, and met his gaze with steady eyes. She'd noticed earlier that his nameplate was missing, a small detail that irked her, though she'd already etched his badge number into her memory from their initial exchange. "My police credentials are in my purse," she replied, her voice smooth and unshaken, a deliberate contrast to his growing intensity. "Would you like me to show them to you?" Her words lingered in the air, and for a moment, the two officers exchanged fleeting glances. Officer Chen, younger and less seasoned, fumbled slightly with his flashlight, its beam wavering as it danced across the pavement. Confusion clouded their faces, and Carmen caught the subtle shift Thompson's jaw tightening, Chen's brow furrowing as if he'd just stumbled into a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You're saying you're a police officer?" Thompson's voice dripped with skepticism, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. He didn't lower his guard. If anything, his posture stiffened, his hand hovering near his radio like a predator poised to strike. Carmen observed every detail, the way Chen shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the way Thompson's fingers twitched as he reached for that radio, likely to call in and verify her claim. She could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, weighing whether she was bluffing or if he'd just stepped into something far bigger than a routine traffic stop. "Before you make that call," she interjected, her tone firm yet measured, "let's take a step back and review what's happened here tonight." She paused, letting the silence settle over them like a heavy blanket. "You pulled me over, claiming my taillight was dimwitch, as we'll see it isn't. You ran an unusually thorough background check for what should have been a minor stop. You ordered me out of my vehicle without any clear probable cause. And then, you had the audacity to question how I could afford a car like this." Her words were precise, each one landing like a carefully aimed dart. She watched Officer Chen squirm, his youthful face betraying a flicker of guilt, his flashlight dipping slightly as if he wanted to shrink away from the moment. Thompson, though, held his ground, his stern expression unwavering, though a faint crack appeared in his armor. "Ma'am, we're just following standard procedure," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of some of its earlier bravado. He straightened, trying to reclaim his authority, but Carmen wasn't buying it. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "Standard procedure? I've been on the force for 20 years, Officer Thompson. Would you like me to walk you through the actual standard procedures for a routine traffic stop?" Her question hung there, sharp and undeniable, and she saw the uncertainty creep into Thompson's eyes. 20 years was a lifetime in this job, longer than he'd likely been wearing the uniform in. She could tell he was scrambling to place her, wondering if their paths had crossed at headquarters or some dusty training session years ago. Chen, still clutching his flashlight, finally spoke up, his voice tentative. "Which division did you say you were from?" The beam lowered at last, as if he were surrendering something. Carmen's smile softened, though her eyes remained piercing. "I didn't say," she replied, her movements deliberate as she reached for her purse. "But since you're curious," she made sure both officers could see her hands, slow and unthreatening. As she opened the clasp, Thompson's radio crackled to life just then, a dispatcher's voice cutting through the stillness. "Unit to 147. Status update on your traffic stop." He responded with a curt "Unit to 147. Stand by," his gaze locked on Carmen's hands, tension coiling in his shoulders. The street around them was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of the patrol car's engine and the occasional rustle of curtains. From nearby houses, nosy neighbors peered out, their silhouettes faint against the glow of their windows, drawn by the drama unfolding under the streetlights. Carmen felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she pulled her credentials from her purse, her fingers brushing the worn leather of her ID wallet. "Here you go, officers," she said, handing the card to Thompson with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her. "I think this will clear things up." Thompson took the ID, and what followed was a spectacle Carmen would replay in her mind for days. His face transformed in slow motion, eyes widening in shock, jaw slackening as realization hit, the color draining from his cheeks until he looked like a ghost caught in the headlights. Without a word, he passed the card to Chen, whose reaction mirrored his partner's in exaggerated detail. Chief Rodriguez," Chen stammered. his voice cracking as he darted glances between the ID and Carmen's composed expression. She straightened her posture, letting the title settle over her like a mantle. "That's correct, Officer Chen," she said, her tone carrying a quiet authority that filled the space between them. "And while this isn't how I imagined meeting my officers, it's certainly been enlightening." Thompson's earlier confidence had crumbled into dust, leaving him grasping for words. "Chief, I didn't," were just she raised a hand, cutting off his faltering excuses. "What you were just doing is exactly what we need to discuss," she said, her gaze shifting between the two men, deliberate and unflinching. "But not here, not now. Tomorrow morning, my office, 9 a.m. sharp. We're going to have a thorough conversation about what standard procedure really means in this precinct." The officers stood frozen, their faces a mix of dread and disbelief, as if the ground beneath them had shifted without warning. Carmen retrieved her ID and turned toward her car, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Oh, and officers," she added, her voice laced with a subtle challenge, "check my taillight now. I want you both to see it's working just fine." She slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool against her skin, and watched in her rearview mirror as Thompson and Chen shuffled to the back of her BMW. Their flashlights swept over the taillight, confirming what she'd known all along: bright, functional, flawless. She turned the key in the ignition, the engine purring to life, and drove off into the night, her mind already racing toward the changes she'd set in motion come morning. For Thompson and Chen, the rest of their shift stretched into an eternity. They sat in their patrol car, the dashboard lights casting long shadows across their faces, neither daring to break the silence at first. The weight of their encounter with Chief Rodriguez pressed down on them, heavy and unyielding. "She planned this," Thompson finally muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow disbelief. "The new chief went undercover in her own precinct, and we just handed her every reason to toss us out on our asses." Chen rubbed his face with both hands, exhaustion and panic warring in his expression. "Did you see how calm she was? She didn't even flinch, just watched us, taking it all in. We're done, man. We screwed up bad." The radio crackled with routine CALS disturbances, noise complaints, but neither officer moved to respond. Another unit would have to pick up the slack while they sat there, grappling with the wreckage of their night. Meanwhile, Carmen pulled into the precinct parking lot, her BMW gleaming under the sodium lights. She didn't get out right away. Instead, she sat behind the wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled, and pulled out a notepad. Her pen scratched across the page as she recorded every detail of officers' words, their actions, the faint tremor in Chen's voice, the stubborn set of Thompson's jaw. Her phone buzzed, a text from her husband, Robert. "How'd the observation go tonight?" She typed back, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline still humming through her veins. "Better than expected or worse, depending on how you look at it. Got pulled over by my own officers." Robert's reply was instant. "Are you okay? What happened?" She smiled faintly, picturing his worried frown. "I'm fine," she texted. "But tomorrow's going to be an interesting day at the office, inside the precinct." She settled into her chair, the faint hum of the building around her a stark contrast to the chaos of the street. She accessed Thompson and Chen's Bodycam footage remotely, her eyes narrowing as she watched the stop unfold from their perspective. Every misstep stood out: the overreach, the veiled accusations, the subtle bias woven into their questions. But she noticed something else too: Chen's hesitation, the way he'd glanced at Thompson with unease when the older officer pushed too far. There was potential there, a crack of doubt she could widen into growth. Thompson was trickier. His record showed commendations for bravery and community work. But tonight's arrogance painted a different picture. She'd need to tread carefully. Around midnight, her office phone rang, jarring her from her notes. It was Sergeant Martinez, the night shift supervisor, his voice cautious. "Chief, I heard about Thompson and Chen. They just filled me in. Should I put them on administrative leave?" Carmen leaned back, the chair creaking under her weight. "No, Sergeant," she said. "Keep them on their regular shift tonight. But I need a favor: watch them closely, not to catch them slipping, but to see how this shakes them up." "How are they handling it?" Martinez hesitated. Choosing his words, they're rattled. I've never seen Thompson this quiet. Chen's flipping through the patrol manual between calls like it's a lifeline. Carmen nodded to herself. Good, that means they're thinking. That's what I want. After hanging up, she opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys as she drafted a new training program. Tonight wasn't just about two officers, it was a symptom of deeper rot, a system begging for overhaul. Her phone buzzed again, this time her daughter, Maria. Mom, is it true? Jackie's dad's a dispatcher, and he said you got pulled over by your own officers. Carmen chuckled. News traveled fast in this tight-knit world. Yes, honey, it's true, she replied. Did you arrest them, fire them, make them direct traffic in the rain? Maria's enthusiasm made her laugh outright. No, she typed. Sometimes the best change comes from teaching, not punishing. As the clock ticked past midnight, Carmen gathered her things, exhaustion tugging at her edges. She walked through the silent precinct, her footsteps echoing off the linoleum, and paused at the front desk where Thompson and Chen would check in tomorrow. She sat down to fold her stare service record seat with a sticky note inside. Everyone has room to grow. See you at 9 a.m. outside. The night sky glittered with stars. The precinct's brick walls bathed in the soft glow of security lights. She took a deep breath, the cool air steadying her. Tomorrow would be tough, raw, messy, necessary. Real justice didn't come from wielding power like a hammer. It came from dismantling the arrogance that abused it, one hard-earned lesson at a time. Driving home, Carmen thought of her mother's old saying, "The best teachers are the mistakes we catch ourselves making." Tomorrow, she'd guide to officers toward that truth, knowing the consequences of their actions and her own would ripple far beyond that quiet street. The road ahead was long, but she was ready. At 8:15 a.m., the precinct buzzed with the faint hum of early morning activity as Carmen pushed through the glass doors, her hands cradling to steaming cups of coffee from Maria's cafe. The little shop, tucked just a block away, was a sanctuary for officers seeking their daily jolt of caffeine. Its worn wooden counter and faded sign a familiar sight to anyone wearing the badge. Today, though, Carmen's steps echoed with purpose as she moved through the hallways, her boots clicking against the linoleum. Around her, colleagues darted out of her path, their hushed voices weaving a web of gossip that trailed her like smoke. The tale of last night's traffic stop had ignited the precinct overnight, spreading faster than a spark on dry grass. And now every glance she caught carried a mix of curiosity and unease. Inside her office, Carmen set the coffee cups down with deliberate care, the rich aroma curling upward as she surveyed the space. Normally, her desk stood like a fortress between her and anyone who entered, a symbol of authority she'd leaned on for years. But not today. Today called for something different. She dragged 3 chairs into a loose semicircle, their metal frames scraping faintly against the floor, and stepped back to assess the arrangement. It wasn't about power or reprimand this time, it was about connection, about peeling back the layers of habit and pride to get at something raw and real. She wanted Thompson and Chen to feel it too, not the sting of a superior's judgment, but the weight of a shared reckoning. Settling into her chair, Carmen flipped open her laptop, her fingers steady as she pulled up the files she'd prepared. 3 videos loaded onto the screen, body camera footage from both officers during last night's stop, plus a month's worth of their previous traffic encounters. Stitched together like a patchwork quilt of evidence, she'd spent hours poring over the data, her eyes tracing the numbers until they burned into her mind. The pattern glared back at her, undeniable and stark. Minority drivers were pulled over 3 times more often than white ones, their stops dragging on twice as long, sometimes stretching into tense, unnecessary marathons of scrutiny. Each click of her mouse felt like a quiet vow to herself. This wasn't just about 2 officers. It was about a system, a culture, a legacy she refused to let fester any longer. At 8:45, a sharp knock jolted her from her thoughts. Sergeant Martinez poked his head in, his broad frame filling the doorway. His brow creased with a worry that seemed to tug at the corners of his mouth. "Chief," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "Thompson and Chen are here. Been in the break room since 8. Thompson's just staring at his coffee like it's gonna bite him. And Chen's already on his 3rd cup, guy's a nervous wreck." Carmen nodded. her lips pressing into a thin line as she absorbed the update. "How'd they handle the rest of their shift?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. Martinez shifted his weight, scratching at the stubble on his jaw. "Different, I'd say. 4 more stops after you left, all by the book textbook, even. They even apologized to some kid for holding him up while they checked his license. Never seen Thompson say sorry to anyone before." A faint smile flickered across Carmen's face, soft but fleeting. "Sometimes all it takes is a mirror," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Send them in at 9 sharp." Left alone again, Carmen's gaze drifted to the photos lining her office walls, each frame a frozen chapter of her life. There was her police academy graduation, her younger self beaming in a crisp uniform, eyes alight with a fire she could still feel simmering inside her. Next to it, a shot from her first day on patrol, her posture stiff with rookie nerves as she stood beside her beat-up cruiser. And then the community award, a polished plaque she'd earned for launching a youth program, a labor of love, born from her own stumbles and second chances. She lingered on that one, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. Every picture whispered a lesson about the cost of missteps, the grace of redemption, and the people who'd trusted her to rise above her flaws. Today, she'd extend that same trust to Thompson and Chen if they could meet her halfway. Right on cue, at 9 a.m., another knock rattled the door. "Come in," Carmen called, her voice steady and warm. The door creaked open, and officers Thompson and Chen stepped inside, their uniforms pristine, badges catching the light like tiny mirrors. Exhaustion clung to them like a second skin. Dark circles shadowed their eyes, and their movements carried the sluggish weight of a sleepless night. Thompson's hair was freshly cropped, the edges sharp enough to suggest he'd stood in front of a mirror that morning, steeling himself for this moment. Chen's hands fidgeted at his sides, betraying the caffeine jittering through his veins. "Good morning, officers," Carmen said, gesturing to the chairs with an open hand. "Please sit. There's fresh coffee if you want it." They obeyed, though their postures stayed rigid, as if expecting a firing squad rather than a conversation. The semicircle threw them off. She could see it in the way their eyes darted to the empty space, where her desk should have been. Carmen leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her gaze shifting between them. "First off, thank you for being on time. And Officer Chen, I hear you've been brushing up on the patrol manual. That's a good sign. It shows you're thinking." Chen blinked, startled, his mouth parting slightly as if to ask how she knew. Before he could, Thompson cleared his throat, his voice taut like a stretched wire. "Chief, before we start, I've got something for you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out with a hand that trembled just enough to notice. Carmen took it, her fingers brushing the crisp paper, but she didn't tear it open. "Is this your resignation, Officer Thompson?" she asked, her tone even. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight. "Yes, ma'am." She set the envelope on her desk, unopened, and met his eyes. "Well, I'm not taking it. Not today, at least." "Want to know why?" Both men frowned, confusion rippling across their faces. "Because running from what we've done doesn't make it right," she said, her voice firm but not harsh. "It just leaves the mess for someone else to clean up." She swiveled her laptop toward them, the screen glowing with the body camera footage from the night before. "What happened last night isn't just about you two. It's about habits we've let grow roots around here, habits that hurt more than they protect. We're going to watch this together, all of it. No arguing, no excuses. Just tell me what you see, plain and simple." Thompson's shoulders loosened a fraction, a quiet exhale escaping him, while Chen seemed to deflate, the breath he'd been holding slipping out in a rush. "Are we still employed?" Chen asked, his voice small, almost lost in the hum of the laptop. Carmen picked up Thompson's envelope and handed it back to him, her eyes steady. "That's up to what happens in this room. I don't want to lose to officers with solid records. I want you to figure out why last night went the way it did and how we keep it from happening again." She hit play, and the grainy footage flickered to life, the sounds of sirens and strained voices spilling into the room. Sunlight poured through the window, painting golden streaks across the floor as the three of them sat, eyes locked on the screen. The traffic stop unfolded in real time, Thompson's brisk strides toward the car, Chen's flashlight cutting through the night. The driver's clipped responses growing sharper with every question. Carmen watched their faces as much as the video, catching the flickers of recognition, the subtle winces as they saw themselves anew. "Stop it there," she said, pausing the footage just as Thompson reached the driver's window. "Officer Thompson, what do you see in your stance?" He shifted, squinting at the frozen frame. "I look ready to fight, Chief. My hand's on my gun already, but there's no reason for it. No threat, no nothing." She nodded, then turned to Chen. "And the flashlighted you need it aimed like that on a street with lamps every 10 feet. Chen swallowed, his cheeks flushing. "No, Chief, I had it right in her face. That's not safety, that's me trying to rattle her." Carmen let the silence settle, heavy and thick, before pressing play again. The video rolled on until the moment Thompson's voice cut through. Sharp and skeptical. "You sure you can afford a car like this?" She paused it again, her eyes locking onto theirs. Care to explain why that question came up? Neither man met her gaze at first. Thompson rubbed his palms together, then stopped, his words halting. "It's just what we do in that part of town. When we see someone like her in a nice car," he trailed off, the weight of his own admission crashing down. Chen shrank into his chair, his face a mask of shame, as if he could will himself invisible. The room went quiet, the hum of the precinct outside fading into a distant murmur. Carmen rose and crossed to the window, staring out at the city sprawling beyond the glass. 10 years ago, she began, her voice soft but steady. "I was driving my daughter to her piano recital. We were dressed up, headed through a fancy neighborhood. An officer pulled us over, no reason, just a hunch. He kept us there for 45 minutes, running every check he could think of. My girl missed her performance that day, but worse. She learned something I couldn't shield her from, that some people will always see her as less. No matter who she is." She turned back to them, her eyes piercing. "She asked me that night, 'Mom, if they treat you like this when you're a cop, what do they do to everyone else?'" Thompson's face drained of color, his hands clenching into fists. "Chief, I didn't mean, I know." Carmen cut in, her tone gentler now. "That's the trouble. It's so ingrained we don't even see I tunnel." Someone holds up the mirror. She returned to her desk and pulled up a new file, a spreadsheet of their traffic stop stats over the past 6 months. "Take a look at this," she said, sliding the laptop closer. "What stands out?" Chen leaned in first, his brow furrowing as he scanned the numbers. "We're stopping minority drivers 3 times more than white ones," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And the stops they last way longer." Carmen tapped the screen. 8 minutes on average for white drivers, 23 for minorities. "Why?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "We dig deeper, run more checks, assume there's something to find, because that's what we've learned to expect." Carmen finished, her words landing like stones in still water. Both men nodded, the truth settling into their bones. Carmen leaned back, her hands clasped in front of her. "Here's the plan. Starting next week, you're both helping me build new training for this precinct. We'll use your footage if you agree as a lesson, not to point fingers, but to show how bias sneaks in when we're not looking. You're not fired," she added, catching Chen's uncertain glance. "Officers who own their mistakes and want to grow, those are the ones I fight to keep." She slid 2 folders across the desk, one for each of them, for the next month. "You're on special assignment. You'll meet with community leaders in the areas you patrol, not in uniform, just as people. You'll listen to what they've seen, what they fear, what they've lived through with us. No orders, no defenses, just ears open." Thompson opened his folder, his eyes scanning the pages before lifting to meet hers. "Chief, why give us this shot?" Carmen's smile was small but genuine, carved from years of hard-earned wisdom. "Because 20 years ago, someone saw past my screw-ups and gave me a chance to do better. And because real change doesn't come from cutting people loose, it comes from building something new together." The sunlight shifted, spilling across the room as the 3 of them sat, the weight of justice and its lessons hanging in the air, a quiet promise of what could be. The room buzzed with tension as she rose from her chair, her posture commanding attention without a single word. Her sharp eyes swept over the officers seated before her, men and women who carried the weight of their badges every day. With a subtle nod, She signaled the end of the meeting, her movement deliberate, like a conductor silencing an orchestra. "We've got a mountain of work ahead," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "Officers, are you ready to step up and be part of something bigger, something that changes everything?" The two men nearest her, Officer Thompson and Officer Chen, straightened their spines as if pulled upright by an invisible thread. They'd slouched into the room earlier, shoulders heavy with the day's burdens. But now they stood tall, their faces set with determination. "Yes, Chief," they answered together, their voices overlapping in a rare harmony before they turned to leave, boots echoing against the tiled floor. Just as they reached the door, her voice cut through the air again, sharp and precise. "Oh." And Officer Thompson, she called, pausing for effect as he froze mid-step. "Keep that resignation letter you drafted. Don't toss it. Let it sit in your pocket as a quiet reminder of the man you're leaving behind, the officer you refuse to be anymore." Thompson's hand twitched toward his jacket, where the crumpled paper hid, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before stepping out. 2 weeks had passed since the traffic stop that shook Precinct 23 to its core, and the building itself seemed to breathe differently now. Carmen, the new chief, had wasted no time reshaping the space. One of the cavernous briefing rooms, once a sterile box of gray walls and flickering fluorescent lights, had been transformed into what she proudly dubbed the Community Connection Center, where faded department memos once hung in lonely solitude. The walls now burst with life photographs of smiling kids from the neighborhood, handwritten stories from residents, and stark charts mapping police interactions across racial and gender lines. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee, a far cry from the stale tension that used to linger. In that room, Officer Thompson stood at the front, his broad frame silhouetted against the projector screen. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the remote, the plastic cool against his sweaty palms. He faced 20 of his colleagues, their eyes fixed on him, some curious, some skeptical, all waiting. "What you're about to see," he started, his voice softer than anyone in the precinct had ever heard it, "is the moment I hit rock bottom. But it's also the moment that taught me more than any training manual ever could." He clicked a remote, and the grainy body camera footage flickered to life, showing the now infamous traffic stop. His younger self barked orders at a driver, his tone clipped and harsh, his stance radiating unchecked authority. The room grew still, the only sound the muffled audio from the video. In the back, Carmen leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, watching not just the screen, but the officers in front of it. She saw how they shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Some tugged at their collars, others stared at their boots. She wondered how many saw their own reflections in Thompson's action show. Many recognized the same arrogance, the same misuse of power. Across town, Officer Chen sat quietly in a community center, his uniform swapped for a plain gray hoodie and jeans. This was his third meeting here, and he'd learned to blend into the folding chairs. Just another face among the residents. An elderly black woman stood at the front, her hands clasped tightly as she spoke, her voice quivering with a lifetime of worry. "Every morning my grandson drives to work. I drop to my knees and pray," she said, her eyes glistening, not just for him to dodge bullets or thieves, but to make it through a police stop alive. "Do you know what that does to a grandmother's heart?" Chen's pen scratched against his notebook, his grip so tight the knuckles whitened. 2 weeks ago, he'd have bristled, ready to defend his badge with a dozen excuses. Now, he just listened, letting her words carve into him, each one a lesson in humility. Back at the precinct, Carmen had rolled out changes that rippled through every corner. In the roll call room, a massive board now loomed over the officers, plastered with colored dots tracking every traffic stop. Green marked clear violations, yellow signaled warnings, and red flagged stops with no citations, each dot tagged with the driver's race and gender. "Take a hard look at your dots," Carmen said one morning, her voice calm but unyielding as she paced before the group. "If you see a pattern, too many red dots clustering in one spot, don't duck the question. Ask yourself why. This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about facing ourselves and getting better." The room hummed with unease. Some officers grumbled under their breath, insisting this transparency would handcuff their work. Carmen had heard it all before and was ready. At the next staff meeting, she stood tall, her presence filling the space. "You want to talk about what makes our job tough?" she asked, her tone cutting through the murmurs. "It's not the data or the rules. It's when we lose the trust of the people we swore to protect. Every time we lean on bias instead of reason. Every time we flex power we don't need. We're draining a trust account that's taken decades to fill. And let me tell you, rebuilding that is a hell of a lot harder than following a hunch." She didn't stop at words. New training rolled out, trading hours of tactical drills for lessons in cultural sensitivity and the tangled history of policing in minority neighborhoods. But Carmen knew lectures alone wouldn't stick, so she mandated something radical, 1 day a month. Every officer ditched the uniform for civilian clothes and stepped into the community not to enforce, but to feel. They rode creaky public buses, their badges tucked away, listening to conversations about rent hikes and potholes. They walked cracked sidewalks, past murals and corner stores, breathing in the rhythm of a world they'd only ever patrolled. They sat in diners, nursing cups of coffee, hearing laughter and arguments they'd never noticed from behind a cruiser's wheel. For Thompson and Chen, these days became more than a requirement, they became a lifeline. Their willingness to bear their mistakes, to admit how Carmen's leadership had cracked them open, earned them quiet respect. Younger officers started seeking them out, leaning across lunch tables with half-eaten sandwiches to ask, "What would you do here?" One rookie, his voice low, confessed to Chen, "I pulled someone over yesterday, young guy, black, driving a beat-up sedan. I was halfway through writing the ticket when your story hit me. I asked myself, would I have stopped him if he were white? And I knew I wouldn't have. So I tore it up, gave him a warning, and let him go." The community felt the shift too. Complaints about unfair stops plummeted by 30% in just 2 weeks. A number Carmen tracked meticulously in a leather-bound notebook she kept on her desk. But the real proof wasn't in the stats, it was in the stories trickling in. A mother posted on a neighborhood forum about an officer who'd helped her son fix a flat tire. Instead of hassling him, a bodega owner bragged about cops stopping by for coffee, not suspicion, each night. Carmen flipped open her notebook, her pen scratching out the day's victories and stumbles. On this evening, she wrote with a faint smile, "Officer Thompson stood up today and showed his footage to the whole precinct. 2 months ago, he'd have burned that resignation letter and walked out the door rather than face his shame. Now he's the one lighting the way for others. This is what justice looks like, not punishment, but growth, one honest, gut-wrenching conversation at a time." She snapped the book shut and gazed out her window as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting golden streaks across her office. On her desk sat a new photo, Thompson and Chen at the community center, laughing with residents over paper cups of lemonade. Next to it, a thank you card from a local woman read, "For the first time, I felt heard by someone with a badge." The precinct radio crackled with its usual chatter, domestic calls, fender benders, lost dogs, but the officers who answered carried something new. It wasn't just protocol in their voices, it was awareness, a quiet promise to wield their power with care. As Carmen grabbed her coat to head home, she caught sight of Thompson and Chen striding toward their patrol car for the night shift. Their steps had changed, no longer the cocky swagger of untouchable authority, but the steady gait of men who'd learned the cost of arrogance and the value of trust. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, Precinct 23 glowed under the morning sun, its brick facade softened by the light spilling through the windows. Carmen walked the halls, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and marveled at the transformation. The walls, once cold and bureaucratic, now danced with color children's drawings from a local school, snapshots of officers at block parties, graphs boasting a 75% drop in traffic stop complaints. Today was no ordinary day. The main conference room brimmed with energy as news crews jostled for angles, their cameras glinting under the lights. The mayor sat in the front row, his tie slightly askew, flanked by city council members and community leaders. Residents filled the seats behind them, their faces a mix of pride and cautious hope. They'd come to witness what the headlines had dubbed the Precinct 23 miracle. Carmen stepped to the podium, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. Behind her, Thompson and Chen sat side by side, their uniforms crisp, but their eyes softer than they'd been half a year ago. She looked out at the crowd, her mind flashing back to that night 6 months prior, a traffic stop that could have ended in resignation or ruin, but instead sparked something extraordinary. Our precinct stood at a crossroads, she began, her voice clear and resonant. We could have clung to the old ways, the ones that chipped away at our community's faith. Or we could choose to be a beacon of what policing should mean: fairness, protection, equality for every soul we serve. She clicked through slides, each one a testament to the upheaval. Trust ratings soaring from 34% to 89%. Officer morale at its peak. Response times slashed because people now welcomed the help they once feared. But she lingered longest on the stories, the human threads that wove the numbers into meaning. She gestured to Thompson, who rose and approached the podium. His broad shoulders squared, but his demeanor stripped of bravado. "That night I pulled over the chief," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of memory. "I thought I was just clocking in, doing the job. But just doing the job isn't enough. We've got to do it right." He painted pictures with his word skids waving at patrol cars instead of scattering. Elderly women dropping off trays of cookies at the precinct. Young men pausing to trade small talk instead of averting their eyes. Chen followed, clutching his weathered notebook like a talisman. "These pages," he said, flipping it open to reveal cramped handwriting, "hold hundreds of voice fears I never understood, hopes I never considered. They rewrote me. They rewrote us all." The mayor took the stage next, announcing that Precinct 23's training would soon spread citywide, with departments nationwide clamoring to replicate it. But the room hushed when Mrs. Jenkins, the grandmother from Chen's first meeting, shuffled forward. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone, tears streaking her lined face. "6 months ago, I prayed every time my grandson left the house," she said, her voice breaking. "Now, when he gets stopped, the officers treat him like a person, not a threat. That's all I ever wanted, to know he'd come home safe." The crowd erupted in applause, but Carmen felt the weight of it settle into her bones. Justice wasn't a gavel slamming down. It was this slow, messy, human change. After the speeches, she led the group on a tour. The Community Connection Center buzzed with life officers and residents sipping coffee, swapping stories over a folding table. In the training room, recruits hunched over laptops, studying bias alongside baton techniques. Outside, Thompson and Chen showed off their patrol car, now stocked with kids' books, water bottles for the homeless, and info cards in Spanish and Vietnamese. As the sun sank, Carmen settled into her office with a steaming mug. A knock interrupted her thoughts, and Thompson stepped in, Chen at his shoulder. "Chief," Thompson said, pulling a tattered envelope from his pocket. "Remember this?" It was his resignation letter, edges frayed from months in his wallet. "I kept it, like you said. But I don't need the reminder anymore. I know who I am now and who I'll never be again." He tore it in half, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and Carmen smiled. Outside, the precinct hummed with purpose, a living testament to the truth that power unchecked breeds ruin. But power tempered by accountability can heal. The air hung heavy with the weight of memory as he stood before me, a living mirror reflecting everything I swore I'd never become. His presence gnawed at me, a persistent echo of a past I'd fought to bury. In his hands, he clutched the letter reload, creased, its ink faded, but its words still sharp enough to cut. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it clean in two, the sound of ripping paper slicing through the silence like a confession. "I don't need it anymore," he said, his voice low but firm, as if he were convincing himself as much as me. His eyes flickered with something grief, maybe, or the faint shadow of regret. "None of us do." Carmen stood a few paces away, her lips curling into a soft, wistful smile. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, gentle yet unyielding, threading through the years. "The best teachers we'll ever have are the mistakes we make ourselves." Those words had rooted deep in her, blooming into a quiet strength she carried like armor. She glanced at the shredded remains of the letter fluttering to the ground and nodded. "You're right," she said, her tone warm but resolute. "It's gone, and we don't need it. But the lesson? That's something we can't ever let slip away." Her gaze drifted outward, past the precinct's weathered brick walls, toward the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. As dusk settled over Precinct 23, the evening shift stirred to life. Officers spilled out into the streets, their boots scuffing against the cracked pavement, their voices mingling with the hum of the neighborhood. They called out to residents by name, Jackson tending his roses, Mrs. Alvarez sweeping her stoop, each greeting a thread stitching the community tighter. Down at the community center, laughter rang out sharp and bright. Kids darted across the basketball court, their sneakers squeaking as they dodged off-duty cops who grinned and trash talked with easy familiarity. Sweat glistened on their foreheads, and the ball thumped rhythmically against the asphalt, a heartbeat of connection in a place that had once known only division. The precinct itself had changed, too. Its heavy doors, once locked tight against the world, now stood propped open well into the night. A faint glow spilled from within, beckoning anyone who needed a listening ear or a safe harbor. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old wood, and the walls bore the scuffs and stories of 1,000 small victories. Carmen felt it in her bones shift, the slow mending of something broken. She'd poured herself into this place, fought for it, and now it breathed differently because of her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her reverie. She fished it out, the screen lighting up with a message from her daughter, Mia. "Mom, guess what? My friend Sarah says she wants to be a police officer. She wants to work at Precinct 23 because she says they do things right there." Carmen's chest swelled with a rush of pride, fierce and tender all at once. She could picture Mia's wide grin, her eyes alight with excitement as she relayed the news. And Sarashi, thoughtful Sarah, who'd spent hours at their kitchen table poring over homework. What must she have seen in Precinct 23 to spark that dream? Carmen's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, her heart full. Before she typed back, "Tell her we're always looking for officers who want to do things right." That's how change happens in person, one decision, one moment at a time. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. Beyond the precinct's glow, the city stretched out, alive and restless. Somewhere out there, a patrol car eased to a stop along a dimly lit street. Its lights flashed briefly, cutting through the twilight as two officers stepped out. Their postures were steady, their voices calm but clear as they approached the Drivera young man, knuckles tight on the wheel, his breath shallow with nerves. "Evening, sir," one officer said, tipping his head slightly. "Just need to check a couple things." "You're all right." There was no edge to his tone, no threat lurking beneath the words. The driver exhaled, his shoulders loosening as he nodded, sensing the respect woven into the exchange. The second officer, a rookie named Daniels, lingered by the car's rear, his eyes tracing the scene. He was new to the force, barely a month in, but he'd already heard the story. Precinct 23 had once been a fortress of mistrust. Its officers feared rather than welcomed. Now, he felt the weight of that shift in every call they answered. He watched his partner, Officer Ruiz, chat with the driver about the busted taillight, his tone light but firm. Ruiz had been here for years, a steady hand who'd seen the precinct's darkest days and stayed to help rebuild it. Daniels admired that quiet resolve. The way Ruiz carried himself, like justice wasn't just a word but a promise. Back at the precinct, Carmen leaned against the doorframe, her gaze sweeping the street. She thought of the letter, its ashes long scattered, and the man who'd torn it apart. He'd been a shadow of her past, a reminder of the arrogance and abuse of power that had once festered here. His choices had left scars, on her and on this place. But they'd also taught her something unshakable. Justice wasn't a gavel slammed or a sentence served. It was the slow, stubborn work of building something better, of holding power accountable so it didn't devour the innocent. She'd seen what happened when authority turned cruel, how it fractured trust, how it hollowed out hope, and she'd vowed to root it out, piece by piece. Across the city, that vow echoed in small, fragile moments. The driver pulled away from the traffic stop with a nod of thanks, a flicker of faith restored. Daniel scribbled a note in his log, his pen scratching against the paper as he committed the night to memory. Ruiz climbed back into the patrol car, his tired eyes crinkling with a faint smile, and Carmen stood watch over Precinct 23. The lesson of consequence burning bright within here, a beacon against the dark, a call to keep going, one step at a time.